You want to say anything about this? About what the concern is. I mean, to me, they wrote a manifesto 2013, and Nicholas Land is the philosopher behind accelerationism. I think the term was coined, if you will, by Noyes, if I'm not mistaken.
You wrote malign velocities, I think.
That's exactly. Yeah, Carl just put it up, Chris. Yeah. In which he used the term accelerationist. They did a manifesto in 2013, and this came out of a group which was very much in touch with the Cybernetic Research Unit, they call themselves. CC.
Noyes was against it. He wrote it.
Yes.
Line velocities. And against it from the left. Right.
But I'm just giving you a little bit of background where these people came from. They came out of a group called the Cybernetic Research Unit.
Okay.
CCRU. Which to my mind was an extension of research, if you remember that journal that was out that tracked military, research for a long time, was a kind of countercultural publication that was very active during the 80s and early 90s. So and then they published a manifesto. This was the left, the so-called left wing of the accelerationist movement, or the liberationist left wing of the accelerationist manifesto for an accelerationist politics in 2013, which was divided into three parts. I find our pandemic papers much more interesting than we did. Bruno and Josh and I contributed to here, and Tony's not here, but anyway, this was their manifesto, which was divided into three basic parts, which was the new breed of cataclysm, the political, the accelerations, and then finally a manifesto on the future, so to speak. And so anyway, but any reasons for the interest, Leslie, or how is that? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes. When I started doing just a little bit of research, I don't have access to all the academic materials that other people do, not yet. So just in terms of what's available out there to the general public, accelerationism came up when I was looking at Anti-Oedipus. And I don't know how much it is a case of, exaggeration or whatever, but some of the right-wing terrible terrorist kind of actions have been linked, what I've read. At any rate, I just wanted to know if you would address that, if that really is a concern, or is
that is a case, and there are white supremacist groups and who wanted quote unquote ethnic cleansing, ethno-cleansing, they would call it, that have come out of that movement, which is a right-wing libertarian movement, which is again based on white supremacy. And again, Nietzsche is a character behind this in certain ways, with the will to power and superiority, the superior race or the master race, which is just interpreted in Nietzsche, but it's taken up multiple times. Please add, Chris. I know you know this.
I just would say that I would add Nick Land to that group. He fosters the right-wing, white supremacy groups.
Well, Nick Land didn't start there. He maybe have taken up that way and drifted to the right, but he started what he considered to be a Marxist approach, in some ways, in his way. Yeah. In England. Yeah. But anyway, this is a very serious matter, because this is how thought at times gets misappropriated and mistaken up. And I'm glad Leslie raised this, because this is a moment of misinterpretation and misappropriation. Yeah, Josh, I see you're unmuted. Yeah.
Oh, no, I haven't read this book, but I got it once to read it. And
Which was it? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing. Yeah.
Demand for Full Automation.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's by Nick Schernick and Alex Williams.
Yeah, Nick Schernick and Alex Williams are the two main players today of a so-called left libertarian accelerationist movement. The acceleration comes out of both Deleuze and Marx in different ways. Of course, Marx is an accelerationist. If you read 1848 on free trade carefully, where he says he's against free trade, it's an unconscionable freedom, but at the same time, he supports it because it will accelerate the movement, to take over the means of production. So in some ways, Marx is a kind of proto-accelerationist, or could be claimed at that level just based on the 1848, writings on free trade in some ways. The other thing, of course, is that they're mostly interested in the right wing is really about speeding up capitalism in order to have it collapse so that there can be a white racial takeover, right? Very much like, I mean, you could relate this kind of modality to what the Israeli, government is doing right now. Let's get rid of Hamas once and for all. Let's get rid of, let's just finally pull off the final, apartheid - genocide. I know I'm being extreme in terms, but it certainly looks this way from the perspective of us here in the West who have followed this since the Balfour Declaration and very well aware of, the history of these movements. So in some ways, yes, that kind of speed, therefore. Yes, Steve, please. Yeah.
I mean, I would just chip in here. I think it's a bit oversimplifying to put Marx into the proto-accelerationist category. I mean, particularly once he got into Capital and this whole concept of the metabolic rift, that John Bellamy Foster and the Monthly Review crowd have written about so much. Yeah. He very much began to understand the limitations, within capitalism. I think became
with you, but I'm just going back to one principle that they could claim. That's all. I'm fully in agreement with you, and they have a whole section on the climate crisis too, in their manifesto. Their manifesto is about 35, 40 propositions. I don't know if anybody's read it, or Leslie, do you have access to this? This is the 2013 manifesto for an accelerationist politics. That is.
I think I found it, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Okay. It begins with the new type of cataclysm. And it basically says the future has been canceled is the working premise. And Steve, the only reason I mention Marx in this case is that they refer to Marx at times. That's all. And I'm trying to see what part of Marx, and Marx textually in 1848, well before the writing of Capital, or for that matter, the notebooks on the Grundrisse, speaks of free trade on the one hand as an unconscionable freedom, right? And something that he's against, of course, but at the same time says that it would help speed up things for, quote, the proletarian seizure of the means of production. That's all that's why I was speaking to that. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So Matt, as usual, has a reference for us here. I'm sorry. I mean, I think this is important, as the Deleuze and Guattari, have taken many different forms in the world. Another one is where Bruno and Tony, who is now here, we were with Celebration, if you will, and the rethinking of empire 20 years later. Tony Negre was like the Wizard of Oz, hidden, but not seen, but heard throughout the discourse. And this was interesting, but this is another way of taking up Deleuze and Guattari's work in a very different vein, So you have these tendencies that grow out of, quote unquote, the rhizomatics, out of the, capitalism and schizophrenia work. So I think it's important we look at the groups that happened. Yes. So to me, the acceleration, of course, on the right wing is totally dangerous. On the left wing, I think it speaks to some people. I mean, they're not stupid. They go back and they talk about Keynes in 1930, the letter to the grandchildren, that we would hit the 3-hour workday. They go the economic prospects for our grandchildren. Those of you that, want to know about the birth of deficit financing, this is where it started, where Keynes started to think through, governments as deficit financing, that we could basically reduce work to basically nothing in terms of the hour day. He really believed this, and this was part of the war machine at work, particularly in England, and then later, post World War II. So anyway, also 1979, they also referred to the neoliberal moment. So on the left libertarian aspect of this is important in a way, because it's part of a discussion among younger people. The Alex Williams, thing. They also take into account, as you say, Steve, the John Bellamy Foster hypothesis about Marx's investigation into metabolic rift, which raises a lot of questions too, because labor is dominant over nature in Marx, right? This is part of the way the world works for Marx. He's always thinking it through the relationship of labor and nature, and has that kind of Cartesian element of still some kind of domination. But that's another long question, and I know you're expert on this. We can certainly speak to that. But they do have in the left appropriation of accelerationism, or the left accelerationists, talk about resource extraction, the middle class being killed. I like this term. I'm starting to think through a term called forced financialization, that pensions, mutual funds, 401ks are really part of something that I'm going to start calling forced financialization, that feeds the billionaire class. That's what's really happening here in this new neoliberal moment. So anyway, they have all of this going on, and they want to incorporate both. And the reason, again, I mentioned Marx, is Marx is present in the manifesto in terms of a retaking both of Marx and Nick Land as an original thinker of this, right? And they also are anti-horizontalism. They're against, quote, the assembly of Occupy. They're against horizontalism. They are for secrecy, verticalism. They have this kind of, moment here that they say part of the problem why left, movements fail is because of the lack of secrecy, the lack of leadership, the lack of verticality that's going on. And they go back, of course, and exclusion too, and exclusionary politics. They seem to be fighting against inclusionary horizontalism throughout, right? So this is another thing, and they think that this points to failures in movement politics. So this can be another aspect that could be debated and talk through. So verticality, secrecy versus that of openness and obviously horizontality is another thing that they're setting up, right? The real thing here, and this leads to something around Deleuze and Guattari, and of course something that we need to talk about, and it's very important for today, is that they're for a socio-technical hegemony, that we should master every aspect of technology to use, right, for the purposes of revolution. So that's one thing that is part of their accelerationist tendency. Do not be in the Luddite position. Do not be so critical of the technology as such, or the mode of technology. I'd rather say technology, we're all thrown into technology. So we have no choice except to think through the epoch. So, you must develop that kind of hegemony, and that's where the acceleration will take place to bring things to a closure, to bring capital to a closure, in a way, to a collapse. And then at that time, then you have the conditions and the new politics in a way. So I'm simplifying here just to open up the discussion. I mean, I'd like to hear from other people. Yes, Carl. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I was just, when I haven't read the Benjamin Noyes book, but I just, was flipping through it. And
He's the critic of them. I'm trying to present where they stand first.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's this the place in Anti-Oedipus where I think this is the accelerationist hypothesis is actually stated. It's in the Penguin. It's 239 to 240. I'll just read it. It's short. They say, but which is the revolutionary path? Is there one to withdraw from the world market, as Samir Amin advises third world countries to do, in a curious revival of the fascist economic solution? Or might it be to go in the opposite direction, to go further still, that is, in the movement of the market of decoding and deterritorialization?
Right.
Perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough from the viewpoint of a theory and a practice of a highly schizophrenic character. Not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to, quote, accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. In this matter, the truth is we haven't seen anything yet. So it seems like that's kind of their proto-accelerationist manifesto.
It's also, Jean-Francois Lyotard, the postmodern condition as well. Should we no longer organize? Should we not accelerate the tendencies? Shall we organize for our pleasure, whatever that means? That could be Sade avec Kant in some ways. We don't know what he meant by that. The failure of the grand narratives, etc. All of these things are, certainly present in our time and part of another part of the political, in a sense. I mean, I don't know, but I have a tendency to see a lot of the movements, right, post 68 as, collapsing. I mean, we're facing now, judgments in Texas where now the minute you hear a heartbeat, an abortion will be illegal. You're getting this from the governor of Texas. You're getting all kinds of reactions at so many levels, right, that are happening here. So one has to think through what are the tasks ahead of us. Is the old thing of demonstration, being on the streets, all of these things, are these working? And why do they speak the way they speak? I think this is the interesting part. I mean, forget the white now. I mean, those people, they can be taken care of. I know they're dangerous, but the real issue is how do you mobilize on this basis with all this high-powered, thinking, how does it go into practice? And you're right, Nietzsche's right. We ain't seen nothing yet, right? It's true, I mean, these were prophetic words, if you remember, he wrote that in 1889. Yeah, we saw 2 world wars, national liberation movements. We're still playing out all of those things globally, many, many regressive things. So I'm not so sure, any of this is over, right? Or that any progress has happened. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, I find, the question of organization and strategy and those things are, things, that are important to me. And it's interesting in Deleuze and Guattari that there's these sections, in the section we were reading for today, where they are addressing this, and it seems like they sort of want both. I mean, they want sort of party organizations that have Leninist aspects to them, but they also talk about, well, why do the party organizations end up adopting the subjugated position and end up reinforcing certain repressive investments of desire, and it's interesting, like they kind of, as I read it, sort of tethering back and forth, and that's how I read it. They sort of return to this theory of the party and the representation of interests and how it's counterposed to the unconscious investments of desire. It's interesting what they're doing, although I don't know if they give us much of a
yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a concrete, step-by-step politics. There's not a how-to book of how to do the political. It's not Saul Alinsky at work here, or you know what I mean, rules for radicals or whatever. But there's certainly hints of maybe stuff that should be avoided and lessons to be learned. And in a sense, the idea here is not to be captured again by representation, right? This is what has to be avoided. This is where they're really going. This is again why the subtitle capitalism and schizophrenia, in many ways. So yeah. But anyway, I'd like to hear, about this accelerationist thing. What you guys are here. I'm not really around a lot of people who talk about this so much. It's not part of the quote academic discourse so much. It's out there. Capitalist realism came out of this. Mark Fisher, who committed suicide, very bright, very good book called Capitalist Realism in England. There was a whole school in England that did this. He's a very bright film critic and writer, and suffered for an enormous depression, from what I understand. I never met him, but I know people that knew him, and so he's another part of this group, right? I don't know if you've read that movement called capitalist realism, but again, they're the ones that say the future has been canceled. There is no future, right?
Escaping Vampire Castle. The other, the most famous piece he wrote was Escaping the Vampire Castle.
Right.
There's a lot of call out culture. But I was thinking when you talked about the acceleration, where are we going? And I've heard that our present day is described as posthumanism. Posthumanism, we are no longer purely human. We're prosthetics. We're partly robotic. And the last revolution will be the revolution of slave robots. Thinking here of the Blade Runner too.
You want to talk about my mother? They take care of Oedipus very early, right? You remember that own moment in the beginning of the film? You remember with the replicant getting the psychological test? What about your mother? He says, you want to know about my mother? Remember, he blows his head off, right? Do you remember this in the beginning of the film? It's a very anti-Oedipal gesture, in some ways. Yeah. And Harrison Ford, a great film, the original. Ridley Scott really had it in those days. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just flashing back on the replicants there.
Acceleration.
Yes, of course. Yeah. But post-human has been there since Heidegger wrote the letter on humanism. And Althusser came out with the letters on anti-humanism, etc. And then the post-human, kind of took off between the biopolitical, and these are all new conceptual arrangements that somewhat come out of what you're saying. And but this is something that Heidegger, after World War II, which some people read as an apologetic for what his political associations during the war. I think that's a very reductionistic reading. But anyway, he wrote the letter on humanism.
Well, Nietzsche said
Nietzsche too, well before. Yes, that's true.
Nietzsche said it's not good to have a memory. Forgetting is the only way. So Heidegger is forgetting a lot too.
Yeah, well, Deleuze and Guattari, if you were to rewrite this as ontology, which I guess, I'm trying to do here in some senses, you ask the question, have we forgotten the question of desire, right? What is the meaning of desire? And then what is the how of the desire? This seems to me to be the ontological question that's being asked here. If you read the history of ontology in terms of our epochs, right, where we have been, if we are now in the epoch of self-consciousness, on the transition, if you will, to this new post-human, as you describe it, Chris. We have to think of being as value, as in Marx. That's what Marx leaves us. Being as power, Nietzsche, right? And then Freud, being as desire. But for Deleuze and Guattari, being as desire is not really addressed fully, that it's still trapped within representational closure. These to me are the serious questions, in terms of epochal thinking, if you will, and that we're on the transition. To my mind, having read, a lot of 20th century philosophy, that this book serves, Difference in Repetition of Deleuze is one of the great transitional books right? We have not come to the synthetic philosophy. I do not buy the fact that Badiou, being an event, and logics of world and immanent truth are the final thing here. I think we're still on the way to do this, and I have a feeling that Anti-Oedipus, alongside of Difference and Repetition and A Thousand Plateaus, are much more better grounds for that kind of thinking, the new epoch, this transition. With Being in Time being the rewriting, if you think of this new thinking of history of being as, epochal systems, that your three great thinkers, if you think of this as the modern, unholy trinity, Marx thinking being as value, that's what the sending was, if you think like a Heideggerian, which is not the worst thing in the world to think them through of what's being sent by the movement, of history and historicality, and being as power in Nietzsche, the will to power, that's what we are. And I think that's what they're reading consistently here, and then of course, Freud being as desire, the question of desire. However, they think that there's still, that desire is too much positioned within the representation of lack and the negative, rather than in terms of the positive and the affirmative. Yes, Carl, I'm speculating. This is speculative philosophy, so bear with.
No, this is very interesting. I don't know if this is sort of jumping ahead of how you want to walk into the text, but one of the things that I think is interesting about this text is that there is sort of, why I'm wondering if other people see this, is that there is, as I see it, while they're trying to kind of, on the one hand, say desire is invested in the social field, and they're trying to move away from these dichotomies, in another way, they seem to be very wedded to that binary in a certain way, and that in some sense, the liberatory moment or movement is kind of the liberation of desire. Like what I like the way you put it, is like freeing it from representational closure. And that, moving outside of those confines and those structures that create lack. And it's interesting that it does seem to kind of be, I guess, in that way, very Reichian, or, that there is sort of like this underlying sphere of desire that's decoded, free, amorphous, polymorphous, polyvocal, all these terms they use. And it's interesting how, it seems like a tension, the more I've read the book, that they're kind of grappling with, they want to kind of do away with it, right? They want to do away with the privatization of desire and the psyche on this, the psychoanalytic couch and the Oedipal figure. But on the other hand, it's still, they're kind of, there's still sort of this nature, and then there's the coding, and that, their intention still, and it's interesting to me. That's how
what do you see as the new binaries? Because I'm kind of interested in how you see a kind of binary thinking going on, because I think that's what they're trying to avoid. I think they're trying to avoid that at all costs, the either or and the neither nor, in many ways. They're trying to avoid both the negative dialectic, if you will, and the the either or of the dialectic too.
But it keeps reappearing. Like, just in really obvious ways. There's the territorialization and the coding on the one hand, and there's the deterritorialization and the decoded flows. There's sort of the Oedipal analysis, and there's the schizoanalysis. And then later in the book, they talk about pre-conscious investment of interests, which are really the, I read that as kind of how people come to think about and identify and then act on behalf of interest. So that's the moment which you actually do decide to support a fascist party, or you do decide to go to the Trump rally, right? But underneath this, there's the unconscious investment of libido. And so I'm just like, it keeps reappearing. Like, as I read it throughout the text.
I understand.
It's an interesting tension.
Okay, let me just retreat for a second, since deterritorialization, going back to Leslie's concern and what Chris and Steve and some others have Josh have contributed here. the idea of deterritorialization is what's taken up by the accelerationists. That is the concept that they want. They want to continually deterritorialize without reterritorialization. So in some ways, they're acting as if there's always a line of flight, right? And that they can get out of it. And this is part of their accelerationist tendency. Their idea, look, on one side of this, it's about, against against the speed. On the other side, it's really navigating speed, right? This is where they're really trying to go. This is what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, more of a navigational moment, right? Than just the speed of the political, etc. So I want to make sure that we're clear here. This is what they're taking from Deleuze and Guattari. They're not really interested in the schizophrenic aspect of, the schizophrenia. They're not interested in the schizzes, the breaks, and these kind of things. They're interested more in how deterritorialization is working in their own, their own upbringing and where they are. And remember, these are people that come out of, computer, out of cyber culture, right? I mean, yeah, these are people that grow up with the internet. We're one full generation and then some from the internet from 1992, and that's a shift, right? 1989, is the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and the defeat of the, capitalist triumphalism, if you will, or, what some people call the end of history. For Marx, it's really the end of prehistory that counts, right? This is really where we really are, where we really get to species being. So anyway, so these are all, I think, very important dates in the chronological sense of the dating, and to see what the reaction is to. So in some ways, this is again about post 9/11 surveillance capitalism, the new police state, the Patriot Act, and what we're getting now. I mean, the way to think this, and this may be something of where this book like Anti-Oedipus and of course 1,000 Plateaus may be of relevance. What does the pandemic surveillance state look like now? What are we really in store for? I can't make a reservation by phone at a restaurant 2 blocks away from myself. I have to go online through a third-party intermediary, figure out all kinds of things. I cannot talk to a human being. We don't take reservations on the phone. Can you imagine? Yeah. I said, can I walk down there and give you my name and put in the, no, you have to do it online. So this is, as Chris says, this robotized, thing. I'm just giving a stupid, everyday example, but I think it's, it's symptomatic. So again, I want us to be aware, and I mean, I'm really glad Leslie brought this up, because there are a lot of young people, very bright, who are taken up by the accelerationist movement, right? You see a lot of this talk has gone on among some people, right? Both right and left, right? In a sense. And the question is, yes, is a political movement supposed to accelerate the destruction, and does that happen through speeding it up? Or is it about pulling the emergency brake on the other hand, like a Walter Benjamin would advocate? We've got to, pull the emergency brake and, do what the Proustian moment would call for, stop time, right? Would that be the part of the moment too? So I think these are somewhat, choices that we need to think through, that are very fundamental, that have been thought through by many of the best minds out there. Yeah. And the French have led us to think that, the accelerationist tendency, if you will, and they've written about this, Virillo, Speed and Politics, the whole, the accelerationist movement that comes out of Deleuze and Guattari, the Libertarian movement of the postmodern condition, the lack of brand narratives, etc. That's another thing that the left wing of the accelerationist movement, they don't believe in folksy, down to earth local politics. This is global for them. They think that's again a wayward notion of the political. So I think we have some real, and there's some real fundamental questions here that really need to be explored as we go forward. So anyway, and they're against transcendentalism all the way too. There's no transcendental involved here. It's all imminent acceleration too. This is another thing as well about the now time. It's about now temporality as well. So anyway, I'm sorry we didn't read the manifesto. I know Matt put it in the thing. They actually are against democracy as a process too, even the left-wing accelerationists. So this is another aspect that is kind of troubling, but at the same time, they're speaking of this in this, as Carl mentioned, the Leninist rupture, if you will, the verticality, the secretiveness, right? The vanguard party, etc. Right? I mean, I know people know about this, J.D. Bernal and Huxley, Julian Huxley, and a lot of these people in England who are on the left really thought that, you needed an aristocracy of scientists running the world. These were Marxists. These were people that said this is really a top bottom, moment, right? In a sense, they did not believe in the Gramscian sense of the revolution from below or reflecting that. They really thought they had the key to the truth and that they were the leaders of this, and that the, Einsteinian universe will organically play out in the social sphere, right? In a lot of ways. So yeah, this is very, very, this is part of the tradition that we have to, look at, face, and understand. Yeah, yeah. So,
but historically, it is very interesting. I mean, this is maybe outside of the scope.
Yeah, can you speak into the microphone a little bit?
Just historically,
okay,
that all successful movements do have leadership and hierarchy. I mean, I think that's been. It doesn't mean that a leader. It doesn't mean that organized hierarchical leadership in and of itself is a sufficient condition to create a transformative movement.
Right.
But that as when I was training in sociology, I worked with people who did a lot on social movement research.
Right.
And that horizontalism has never produced a transformative movement, as far as I know. But,
right. Right.
Anyway, it's.
I don't know, Leslie, is this helping? I mean, any thoughts? And what's going out there on the Canadian West Coast on this accelerationist stuff? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is very helpful. I really appreciate it. I've got much more clarity on this issue. And
is this part of a discussion out there? I mean, is this an act? I mean, I know that British Columbia has a great degree of, alternative culture for many, decades. And and I know that there's a libertarian strain there, very active.
Absolutely, and I see it with the young people and the frustration with us gray hairs, and I see their frustration. Right. It's a bit of a war out here in terms of the left with those who believe that we do have to bring, does this tie in with intersectionality, that whole issue as well, this idea of horizontalism? Is that intersectionality?
Partially, yeah. Yes, you could call it that. I think intersectionality is a very bourgeois conception of the way things work. It depends on who you're following, in a sense, but I think it's a way of, it plays very much into the left liberals' hands, in a sense, right? Yeah. And the horizontality as well. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's kind of interesting that, was it not you who talked in another seminar about Steve Bannon and his bunch who've studied Lenin and the sense of vanguard, and it's an amazing world.
Watch 2022 at work early on. Here we go. We're not so far away from November 2022, right? Exactly. No, it's true. Yeah, and I mean, they simplify things, but again, if you think about this, and I'm really glad you brought this up because they're reading the right wing of this, right? They are right D and G people who will use the language. They'll maybe even talk about deterritorialization. You have to remember this, in many ways. So to think about how this language then becomes appropriated how it becomes divested of its, original meaning, or the, and I'm very much for material etymology. When a word came into uses, what were the material conditions that produced that word, and what, for example, in Greek, ousia, which literally means substance in Aristotle, the last definition of ousia is real estate. So it's very interesting. The man of substance in Marx, Marx knows this very well, is, the last definition of substance in Aristotle, ousia, right? So it's very, very interesting if you start studying from that standpoint as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that these are all very interesting remarks. But I think, yeah, Josh, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Because when I read through this, I haven't read a lot of Deleuze at all, and so when I read through this, I was actually quite astonished that they were more Marxist than I thought that they would be, actually.
Yes.
And
right.
And even these lines where they say, that brief line that Carl read, it's like, okay, they posed the question, but it's a very open question. It's not one that they even posed answers to at all, really.
Yeah.
Then they pick up on the biological and stuff, but a lot of people were doing that as well. And then even in the sense of that they were talking about this kind of sense of the avant-garde, which I can read in here too. But then in the section on Lenin, he talks about specifically how the avant-garde in Lenin led to the reestablishment of the state, essentially, as this sort of surrogate bourgeoisie. So there are, like, I guess that there's just a lot of voices in this book, and like we had said last week, and so you can really read this how you want to, I suppose. In a lot of ways, because I think they make the case both ways many times, and in many cases.
I think it's important. Look, I mean, tonight we should really go here. They're really speaking from the point of delirium. Part of their thing about the schizophrenia, and by the way, I want to recommend a book to people interested in clinical practice or in schizophrenia. Arietti is his name. Probably David and Jane know Silvano Arietti, was a great Italian psychoanalyst who studied schizophrenia. He wrote a book called The Introduction to Schizophrenia. And he had very important things to say about that, right, in a way, and was kind of the leading thinker, if you will, phenomenologically on schizophrenia and schizoid, the treatment of schizophrenia as well. He had both a biological and a psychological model at work, and he went through, many levels of this. There were in the book, if I remember it correctly, there are like 4 chapters just devoted to the biology of schizophrenia. So his name is Silvano Arietti, dated 1974. But again, I don't know how far we've gone from a lot of this thinking back, post 50s, 60s, and early 70s. But anyway. But Deleuze and Guattari are trying to go, I think, a step further. I mean, you can read off that book too, in the clinical sense. They're really interested in the lived experience, and they really are looking at what they call intensities. They're really looking at the lived intensities, or the lived, if you will, intensity of the schizophrenic that passes what they call the biological gradient, the threshold, in a certain way, to use a language like Bruno likes, the gradient or the threshold, and how this intensity, if you will, becomes traversed, right, beyond representational closure. So in a way, they're really studying, if you will, or their object, if you will, or subject, excuse my language, their subject is really the psychotic that doesn't, that never comes back, in a way that they want to take that psychotic that Freud avoids, right, in a way, because it cannot be re-territorialized into the Oedipus narration, et cetera, and actually have that character, if you will, that clinical entity, if you will, become part of, a movement that both demonstrates where capital is, and also you cannot put this back on the couch, right? because what's going to happen there is reterritorialization. So they don't want that reterritorialization. I read this in Lacanian terms as, that this is the realm of the imaginary, that they really are very much going against the symbolic and the law. This is where they really are in terms of their dialogue, if you will, with Lacan and with French psychoanalysis at that time. And this is a very important part of the book, I think. I think they're very respectful at one level to Lacan's return to Freud, but they still see a limitation there, right? They understand the return, to Freud. But, in Freud, he could not get out of the closed representation. That's what they're really trying to do. Whether they're successful or not, I know, Carl, you have this thing about mediations. They are not about mediations at all. There's no mediations in this work. They're really trying to get to the unmediated intensities. And that's why they always go to Antonin Artaud in terms of the body without organs. He's their, representative figure, right? What he experiences in his delirium. And that's another reason they want to get to this experience, lived intensity of delirium, where there are two poles. And this to me is where the politics is in the psychoanalytic, the political psychoanalytic register. The delirium has the tendency on the one hand to go the fascist pole, can be reinscribed at the fascist pole, much like we were talking about the right-wing accelerationism. So that clinical delirium can go to the fascist pole, or it can take on the revolutionary pole as desire. So they're always looking out for that. So there's always, to speak of the binary, I think they're always on a double vigilance. They're looking at delirium. How does delirium become reinscribed, reterritorialized in terms of a pole that can become fascist desire, or when does it become revolutionary desire? Yeah, this I think is very, very important to keep in mind here. That this is very important. And the fascist desire says, I am of a superior race, very much like the right-wing accelerationism, the new white supremacy. I am of a superior race. I am of the master race. Whereas the other one says, I am of an inferior, and this is Rimbaud speaking, I am of an inferior race. I am not of you, right? Right? I am an inferior race, always and forever. And that's Arthur Rimbaud's poetic speaking, which, in a way, as Lydia knows, is one of the central characters of Julia Kristeva's book on poetic revolution and the symbolic poetry of the 19th century in France. So I think we have to keep this in mind, because they're really trying to get to this delirium that they see all too early covered up, if you will, by psychiatry, by the system, by the mental health professions and all of this, that we've got to control this delirium. Instead, they want to look at this delirium and see where the desire is. Where is the desire in this delirium? And will it go the way of the fascist pole? How does this take up? But they think deeper than that, deeper and more deeply sedimented, that needs to be activated, is this, I am of an inferior race, always and forever, the Rimbauden moment, which in a way is a subversion and a real, I don't know if you've ever read the great poem, Democracy. It's a great example of where we are today, verticality and horizontality. Yes, Carl, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
I guess clear
that again, it seems to me that what they're doing is they are sort of saying, the path to liberation, or the terms they would use, is the exit or the lines of flight, or the possibility of exodus from these repressive operations is to sort of return to this unmediated, decentered, decoded level of desire. I mean, it seems so. Then the question would be, well, and they pose this repeatedly, and this comes back in this final part very strongly, is, well, why does desire take either of these two forms? Why does it take a more authoritarian or more,
Well, one thing that they do is interesting, again, is they take on the death drive in Freud, beyond the pleasure principle. And they take on the death drive, which so unfortunately Richard's too busy because he studies this actively, et cetera, and he can contribute. But anyway, all to say, they take the death drive, Deleuze and Guattari, and say, we need to take that away in a sense, right? This is something that Freud had that really has hurt our movements because it's based on thermodynamics and it's based on a principled model that does not go to the body without organs or the degree zero of intensities. That's what they're really trying to get to and go beyond. And if those of you that know Reich's argument with Freud on masochism, that masochism was a secondary drive and it also was still based in the death drive. And for Reich, the death drive was secondary. It was not primary as Freud saw it, or in this dialectical tension between Eros and Thanatos. And, and again, why this book, in my view, I mean, I've read Marcuse very seriously, Eros and Civilization. To me, this is a very big advance on Marcuse in terms of both the clinic, the practice, and the insights, to my mind, much more, even though, it's 17, 20, almost 20 years later than Marcuse, and certainly has absorbed it, right? Because Marcuse is trying to rewrite everything in terms of Eros, right? There's a Reichian moment there, but Marcuse does so through a utopian speculation. I think they're really looking at what desire is. They're really posing this question, which is very difficult to find out. You go to the psychoanalyst, the analyst says, well, what do you want? I mean, just think of it this way in terms of the narrative. And you start telling your story, and then well, what do you really want, right? And this is really the point of the poles that I think they're really talking about. And where's that experience of delirium where you can understand what poles are going on? And we have many films about this in terms of intensities. I mean, Salo being one great example, but again, I think Theorema has this example too, very much. And if you look at Pasolini, if you look at Il Conformista in a way, you begin to see the inability of the character of Clerici, Jean-Louis Trintignant plays in the film. He is unable to make a choice. He is unable to make a choice. He is stuck in complete reterritorialization. Every time he gets close to delirium, right, etc., the fascist pole takes over. I think this study is I don't think Bertolucci has this in mind, but you can look at the artist's consciousness and read some of that into that. I guess you all know this, right? This story. It's the story of a bureaucrat who was brought in to go assassinate an ex-professor of his who's in exile in Paris of the communist movement, right? He falls in love, so to speak, with the professor's wife, right? Dominique Sanda, a wonderful role by her, and anyway, but he can't make a decision based on Eros or based on really lived experience. He's coded. He's conformist. He takes this fascist pole of desire up instead of choosing the revolutionary pole. He can't even shoot the man that's driving the car, watching his lover being shot in the end scenes. So it's pretty amazing. And he betrays his blind friend, when they're going to kill the fascists too, right? Yeah.
I guess.
Okay, so I'm trying to elucidate a little bit through. Yeah.
I think I like that articulation. I mean, the question I just keep coming back to throughout.
Yeah, you got to speak into the microphone. I've been listening.
Like
I got re-territorialized by swinging at the Savoy with Clifford Brown and Max Roach before this.
There you go.
So I'm re-territorialized right now. Yeah. So go ahead.
So, that my question would be, is, well, why does it take these forms? And I think that in the end, I guess, part of what I have come to see is a limit of the book. And I think it's a limit of how they set up the whole way in which they enter into the realm, the problems or the domain that they're trying to enter into.
I think our problem in reading here in some ways is that they're not really about the why only. They're about the how. How does this
Yes,
happen?
but
Always going on. And when you begin to look at this moving forward in their work over the next 10, 15 years, it's all about the pragmatics
Mhm.
of communication, etc. They're very advanced on this stuff. I mean, in many ways. I mean, it's not like they're asleep at the wheel after this book or even after Mill Plateau. They're really taking up, at many levels, these different planes. I don't think they're really interested in explanations so much. I think they're interested in how this has occurred, right? I mean, in a sense. So yeah, very different thing.
Well, so do you mean like how it has happened that people choose repressive political, that we opt for authoritarianism? I mean, you can't, or how do we get out of it? I mean, you could just say, ultimately, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It happens. What's the strategy to resolve the problem?
Right. I'm going to let Josh speak. Yeah. Go ahead, Josh.
I was just thinking about what Carl was saying, and to me, it's not so much that the escape is escaping from, or an escape to return to this amorphous, decentered subject, although that's what it is. It's that we are already that body without organs, that thing, that decentered subject, and that we're being imposed these codes by capitalism ultimately on us. And what the escape is from the codes of capitalism ultimately. And to the point about the sort of voluntary servitude, it's that I think he has a really good line actually about this, about how do we have political movements or ideas that are incapable of being recoded back into the capitalist system. And I think that that's more the emphasis of the book to me in my reading than trying to get back to something, I guess.
But don't you think you need to know to answer that question, or to pose, a strategy forward, a practice, as it were? Don't you think it, to some degree, presupposes knowing why it happens in the first place? I mean, if you don't know how, if you don't understand the mechanism,
I think they understand the mechanisms better than almost anybody.
Well,
I think that's what they're really doing, is undoing mechanisms throughout. I mean, they're using they're using these signposts. This is the interesting thing to me. They use Antonin Artaud's theater of cruelty against the theater of representation, the theater of Brechtian alienation, which can be retaken by the capitalist system. They're looking for all these forms. The Henry Miller of the wayward Miller of the air-conditioned nightmare, and Sexus, Plexus, and Nexus, the D.H. Lawrence, all of these moments are things that they're really, really trying to work with in terms of the machinic, right, if you will, that overcoding that is always taking place that can't be recodified in a sense, in a way. So the nomad thinking is always operative here. It's always presupposed. They're looking at this. We are, and I think as Josh says, a priori they think of us as body without organs. We're not. They a priori are really thinking this through. At this level. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no,
we're not all neurotic like Freud says. We are all, that is the predication in a sense in the book. But we're flux. We're material and semiotic flux. And again, there's no distinction between production and product here. The desire is never associated, and this is, I think, the radicality and maybe even a limitation. I'm not sure, in some ways, because we're in very regressed times. But if you think about this, but desire is never associated with representation for them. Once it becomes associated with representation, that pole of delirium is going to lead towards reterrorization, and in some cases, fascism. That is one of their explanations of the mechanisms that are going on and why they're, in a sense, right? So, yeah. So desiring production is always producing. This is not about intersubjective relations or interpersonal relations, or, and this is, desiring production is independent of all these things. Yeah, this is their working hypothesis. This is their Marxism at work. It's the Marx of capital. It's not the humanistic Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts. It's the Marx of capital that's being read here.
I would also say that their Marx is the Feuerbach, the thesis on Feuerbach, where we are social relations ultimately, right? It's number
Well,
6.
yeah, that, I mean, of course, yeah. Or the German ideology that social relations determine consciousness.
Right.
Always. Yeah. Right. I mean, yes, of course. Yeah. I mean,
just,
remember that they're very influenced by, this is a circle of thinkers. Again, I mean, I'll put it in interpersonal terms. This is a circle of thinkers that are part of the post-reading capital group, right? This is 69, 70, 71 when they're working on this work. This is 4 or 5 years after reading Capital by Althusser, right? And the symptomatic reading and processes of articulation and all of this. So this is very important, and the epistemological circle around Lacan and Jacques-Alain Meunier. So you have these forces that are all playing with each other in a sense, and over and about each other that are coming up with this stuff. This is not American, sociology or made in USA psychoanalysis. And with all due respect, I mean, it's this is something very different that's at work here with their reading off of. I'm not saying, listen, I'd rather live in other places than Paris today. I used to love Paris. Today, it's a very different place than it was the Paris that I have known in the past, in many ways. And, and it has a very good chance of becoming, a national front election. What might happen? Le Pen may win the election against Macron. I mean, there are tendencies this way. So for all of the sophistication and the thinking, on the ground, you have this kind of real desire for nationalism, return to the past, the glory of France, all this kind of nonsense. Make France great again is really what's going on there, right? In a way. And speaking of Steve Bannon, yes, he's friends too, right? He's friends with Marine Le Pen. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think,
I mean, so I'd like us to keep this in mind, as we go forward. Yeah, but please, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I think more what I'm,
Again, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Well, one of the things I did when I was, as we've been reading this, was to read Freud, and I was very impressed with. I mean, I have on one level, a very superficial knowledge of this, so I would be very interested in people who really know this stuff, what they think. But I was very impressed with the tentative nature of what a lot of Freud is saying, how he's saying that this is what I think, this is what we think, but we may have to abandon all this later. We may find out totally different things. And there's a certain fidelity in Freud to, the empirical lived experience. He is a clinician. I mean, I looked up and he spent like thousands and thousands of hours, many years, seeing patients. And there's an attempt to kind of understand the unconscious, but he's working with real material that's being presented. Now, we can make all the criticisms. I actually agree with a lot of their criticisms. I do. I mean, with the whole way in which.
But again, I don't think it's a critical work in that respect. If you're going to the place that they somehow aren't dealing with lived experience, they are. This is a militant psychoanalyst who works in a clinic where there is a domination of schizophrenics and psychotic. He's working in an institution, and in an institution that was famous during the war, for a place where the mentally ill and the resistance met. This became a place of where the resistance would come together. Laborde Clinic and Jean Henri, these were people that fought against the Nazis, and they used the mental asylums as places, secret locations for the resistance. This is pretty amazing stuff when you really think about this, the ground that this is coming out of. I mean, I'm just saying, because when I hear something like lived experience, they're looking at lived experience too, right? I mean, it's not like
Well,
they're outside
yeah.
some planet on LSD. They may be on LSD a few days during this time, which I understand is making a clinical comeback, or MDMA, ecstasy and these kind of drugs. But anyway, in the treatment of mental illness.
But Michael,
yeah,
I think you're kind of missing maybe I'm just confused. But
okay.
more what I'm talking about is that they are proposing a certain model of, and I think we could say they're not making arguments, they're not doing it now, but they are consistently over and over and over throughout the book. I mean, it almost becomes monotonous in its repetition. They are talking about a certain structuration of the unconscious field that has certain characteristics that they counterpose to the way in which the unconscious, as I understand, is represented in Freud and maybe other thinkers. And I think and I think when they actually try but it's sort of like they propose it as kind of like a presupposition, which is fine. But I think that presupposition, I'm not sure it can bear the weight of what they ultimately want it to do. That's my feeling about it. And that the point I'm making is that I don't really see them. I was hoping to sort of, they would get more concrete at a certain point, that there would be the entry of Guattari's actual experience in the clinic in a more immediate way. And it's like, what I see is that they talk about molecular unconscious, they are talking about genetic, they're talking about the biological aspect of it, which is ultimately, it seems like, where they want to go. But I just don't, I'm not sold on it, shall we say. I'm not.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if they're trying to sell a program here. I think they're trying again to intervene in terms of what they're seeing as certain mechanisms that they think they can undo during that period. They really understand, some kind of causality. It may be against the incompetence of the French psychiatric scene during that period. That's one aspect of it. I actually read Being in Nothingness as an attack on, French Freudianism before Lacan. I mean, I think that this is one of the objects of art. It's a work of psychology. I mean, it's a phenomenological ontology, but it's a work of psychology. But I think, again, I think they're very humble. I mean, I think maybe we could go to the end and see where they leave us, right? They leave us hanging, but it's kind of interesting the way they do it, right? I mean, in a sense. So I'm going to go to the last two pages, page 380. Let me maybe a little bit earlier than that. Anyway, it begins on page 378. The actualization of a revolutionary potentiality is explained less by the pre-conscious state of causality. This is about 4 pages from the end. The paragraph begins, the actualization of revolutionary potentiality is explained less. So remember, they're looking for revolutionary potentiality, looking for an agent. Like Nietzsche used to make fun of the German philosophy students. Everybody used to go look for the categorical imperative in the bushes, right? So anyway, they're, this is what they're looking for. This revolutionary potentiality is explained less by the pre-conscious state of causality in which it is nonetheless included than by the efficacy of a libidinal break at a precise moment, a schiz, whose sole cause is desire. Sole cause is desire, not need, not, hardship, etc. Which is to say, the rupture with causality that forces a rewriting of history on a level with the real and produces this strangely polyvocal moment where everything is possible. Of course, the schiz has been prepared by subterranean labor of causes, aims, and interests working together. Of course, the order of causes run the risk of closing and cementing the breach in the name of the new socius and its interests. Of course, one can say that after the fact that history has never ceased being governed by the same laws of aggregates in large number. The fact remains, and this is important, that the schiz came into existence only by means of a desire without aim or cause that charted it and sided with it. While the skids is possible without the order of causes, it becomes real only by means of something of something of another order, desire, the desert desire, the revolutionary investment of desire. And that is indeed what undermines capitalism. This is where they're trying to go. I think this is very crucial to see what the project, where will the revolution come from? And in what form within the exploited masses? It is like death, where and when. It will be a decoded flow, a deterritorialized flow that runs too far and cuts too sharply, thereby escaping from the axiomatic of capitalism. Will it come in the person of a Castro, an Arab, a Black Panther, a Chinaman on the horizon? A May 68 homegrown Mao was planted like an anchorite or a factory smokestack. Always the addition of an axiom to seal off a breach that has been discovered. A fascist colonel start reading, and this is exactly what they did.
Yeah.
Start reading Mao. We won't be fooled again. Castro has become impossible, even in relation to himself. Vacuoles are isolated, ghettos created, unions are appealed to for help. The most sinister forms of dissuasion are invented. The repression of interest is reinforced. But where will the new eruption of desire come from? So they ask, those who've read us this far will perhaps find many reasons for reproaching us. For believing too much in the pure potentialities of art and even of science. For denying or minimizing the role of classes and class struggle. For militating in favor of an irrationalism of desire or identifying the revolutionary with the schizoid. For falling into familiar, all too familiar traps. This would be a bad reading. And we don't know which is better, a bad reading or no reading at all. And in all probability, there are far more serious reproaches to be made, which we haven't even thought of. As for those we have named, we hold in the first place that art and science have a revolutionary potential. And what departments are being destroyed in all the universities across the United States and globally in the name of job readiness, et cetera? Where do they go after right away? Yeah, always. This is almost absolutely predictable in any kind of politics of austerity or anything that happens after, there's an uprising. From the standpoint of a signifier, signifiers are necessarily reserved for specialists, but that art and science cause increasingly decoded and deterritorialized flows to circulate in the socius, flows that are perceptible to everyone, which force the socio-axiomatic to grow even more complicated, to become more saturated, to the point where the scientist and the artist may be determined to rejoin an objective revolutionary situation in reaction against authoritarian designs of a state that is incompetent and above all castrating by nature. For the state imposes a specifically artistic Oedipus, and this is important to remember, how the state can impose an artistic Oedipus and specifically scientific Oedipus. Dr. Fauci every day, Fauci, right, etc. We begin to have this. Our trusted figures, think about the representation that's going on during the pandemic. Secondly, they're going to go on to the next one, right? The revolutionary. We have not at all minimized the importance of preconscious investments of class or interests, which are based in the infrastructure itself. But we attach, and this is important, all the more importance to them as they are the index in the infrastructure of a libidinal investment of another nature, and they can coincide as well as clash with them, which is merely in a way to pose the question, how can the revolution be betrayed? Of course, which is the title of a book for those of you that know Deutscher's, studies of Trotsky, the prophet betrayed, right? Once it has been said that betrayals don't wait their turn, but they are there from the very start. So it's not only the fascist pole, it's also the revolutionary pole that is being examined here, right? Yeah, the maintenance of paranoid, unconscious investments in revolutionary groups. Again, these are clinical practices. They're experimenting with this. Guattari is doing this group fantasy experiments at the Laborde Clinic, collective fantasy, not individual fantasy, right? And if we put forward desire as a revolutionary agency, it is because we believe, and I like this, desire as a revolutionary agency. Very important. It is because we believe that capitalist society can endure many manifestations of interest, right? But not one manifestation of desire. And I think here, I'll stop here for a second. Every time I've been in a union negotiation or I read union negotiations around, it's all about wages and benefits. It's never about let's change the structure of the place, let's change the workplace, let's make it better, for the educational mix. How do we really improve upon this? It's always about interest. You play right into the hands from the beginning into the hands of it. Never about desire.
On my book, it's 338, Michael, at the top.
What's that?
On my book, it's 338 at the top of the page. It says, how many revolutionary groups as such are already in a place for co-option that will be carried out only in the future and form an apparatus for the absorption of a surplus value not even produced yet, which gives them precisely an apparent revolutionary position.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think they're really developing something here. Let me just finish reading just a little bit here, and then we'll go to more discussion. So this is interesting, yeah. And if we put forward desires, it is because we believe that it can endure many manifestations of interest, but not one manifestation of desire, which would be enough to make its fundamental structures explode, even at the kindergarten level. Why is there such behavior? Why do you have children chained? They're going to tell you it's for their safety. But what is the ropes around children when you take them? Beryl knows this. Beryl, put that in your next essay on children and commodification, techniques of control for children. Anyway. So anyway, let me go on. We believe in desire as in the irrational of every form of irrationality. This is interesting, right? Every form of irrationality, as in the not because it is a lack or it's a thirst or as an aspiration, but because it is the production of desire, the title of your mentor's or your professor's book. Right? Desire that produces real desire or the real in itself. Finally, we do not at all think that the revolutionary is schizophrenic or vice versa. On the contrary, we have consistently distinguished the schizophrenic as an entity from schizophrenia as a process. Very interesting. Keep this in mind, right? Now the schizophrenic as entity can only be defined in relation to the arrests, the continuations in the void, or the finalist delusion that repression imposes on the process itself. This explains why we have only spoken of a schizoid pole in the libidinal investment of the social field, so as to avoid as much as possible the confusion of the schizophrenic process with the production of a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic process, the schizoid pole, is revolutionary in the very sense that the paranoid method is reactionary and fascist. And it is not these psychiatric categories freed of all familialism that will allow us to understand the political economic determinations, but exactly the opposite. So this is their role of determination. So then, above all, we're not looking for a way out when we say schizoid analysis as such has strictly no political program to propose. If it did have one, it would be grotesque and disquieting. Now, I love this at the same time, right? In a way, right? It does not take itself for a party or even a group, right? And does not claim to be speaking for the masses. No political program will be elaborated within the framework of schizoid analysis. Finally, schizoid analysis is something that does not claim to be speaking for anything or anyone, not even, in fact, especially not for psychoanalysis. Nothing more than impressions, the impressions that things aren't going so well in psychoanalysis and that they haven't been since the start, right? We are still too competent. We would like to speak in the name of an absolute incompetence. Someone asked us if we had ever seen a schizophrenic. No, we have never seen one. If someone reading this book feels that things are fine in psychoanalysis, we're not speaking for him or for him, we take everything back we have said. Here comes their humor in a sense, but it's interesting the way they do that. So what is the relationship? And this, Carl, I think, begins to address your question, between schizoid analysis and politics on the one hand, and between schizoid analysis and psychoanalysis on the other. Everything revolves around desiring machines and the production of desire. Schizoanalysis as such does not raise the problem of the nature of the socius to come out of the revolution. It does not claim to be identical with the revolution itself. Given the socius, schizoid analysis only asks what place it reserves for desiring production. What place, this is important, what role and place does desiring production, their main concept here, what generative role desire enjoins therein, in what forms the conciliation between the regime of desiring production and the regime of social production is brought about, since in any case it is the same production, but under two different regimes, right? If on this socius as a full body, there's the possibility, thus the possibility from going from one side to another, that is from the side where the molar aggregates, and remember, molar and molecular refer to modes, right? Not to be taken literally, they're modes in their conceptual apparatus, are organized, and to this side, no less collective, where the molecular multiplicities of desiring production are formed. Whether and to what extent such a socius can endure the reversal of power such that desiring productions subjugate social production and yet does not yet destroy it. Since it's the same production working under the difference in regime, if there is, and how there comes to be, a formation of subject groups. If someone retorts that we're claiming the famous rights to laziness, Paul Lafarge, of course, famous book, to non-productivity, right? Worker slowdown, slacker, etc. To dream and fantasy production, Disney and company, right, etc. Or Frank Baum, right? Once again, we are quite pleased since we haven't stopped saying the opposite. And the desiring production produces the real, and the desire has little to do with fantasy and dream, you know, as opposed to Reich, and this is interesting, as opposed to Reich, schizoid analysis makes no distinction in nature between political and libidinal economy. This is interesting, right? Again, the synthetic moment of desiring production, there is no distinction between political economy and libidinal economy. Very interesting here. I think, some people have called it libidinal Marx, yeah. Schizoid analysis merely asks, what are the machinic, social, and technical indices on a socius that open to desiring machines, that enter into the parts, the wheels, and motors of these machines as such as they cause them to enter into their own parts, wheels, and motors? Everyone knows what a schizoid is, a machine. All schizoids say this, and not just little Joey. Joey is the Bruno Bettelheim case in The Empty Fortress. That's the reference there. The question to be asked is whether schizophrenics are the living machines of a dead labor, and here's Marx, right? Which are then contrasted to the dead machines of living labor as organized in capitalism, or whether instead desiring technical and social machines join together in a process of schizophrenic production that thereafter has no more schizophrenics to produce. In the letter to the ministers, Maud Manoni writes, and they're not crazy, and those of you know Franz Fanon, big debate with Maud Manoni about African Oedipus, and anyway. One of these adolescents declared unfit for studies does admirably well in a third level class, provided he works some in mechanics. He has a passion for mechanics. The man in the garage has become his best therapist, right? If we take mechanics away from him, he will become schizophrenic again. Very interesting right here. The best, is this. By the way, Lydia, I guess she's not in the room at the moment, but anyway, Julia Kristeva actually reports this in a dissertation defense on Lacan back in the 70s, reports this exact letter too. So it is a famous letter to the minister. Her intention is not to praise ergotherapy or the virtues of social adaptation. She marks the point where the social machine The technical machine and the desiring machine join closely together and bring their regimes into communication. She asks if our society can handle that and what it's worth if it can't. And this is indeed the direction the social, technical, scientific, and artistic machines take when they are revolutionary. They form desiring machines for which they are already the index in their own regime at the same time that the desiring machines form them in the regime that is theirs and is a position of desire. And then finally, what is the opposition between schizoid analysis and psychoanalysis when the negative and positive tasks of schizoid analysis are taken as whole? We constantly contrasted two sorts of unconscious or two interpretations of the unconscious. The one schizoanalytic, the other psychoanalytic. The one schizophrenic, the other neurotic Oedipal. The one abstract and non-figurative, the other imaginary, but also the one really concrete, the other symbolic. The one machinic, the other structural. The one molecular, microphysical and micrological, and the other molar or statistical, right? The other ideological, one material, the other ideological, the one productive, the other expressive. We have seen how the negative task of schizoid analysis must be violent and brutal. Defamiliarizing, de-Oedipalizing, schizoid analysis must be violent, brutal, decastrating, undoing theater, undoing dream and fantasy, decoding, deterritorializing, a terrible curettage, a malevolent activity, but everything happens at the same time. For at the same time, the process is liberated, the process of desiring production, following its molecular lines of escape that already define the mechanics tasks of the schizoid analyst. And the lines of escape are still full molar or social investments at grips with the whole social field, so that the task of schizoid analysis is ultimately that of discovering for every case the nature of the libidinal investments of the social field, their possible internal conflicts, their relationship with preconscious investments of the same field, their possible conflicts with these, in short, the entire interplay of desiring machine and the repression of desire. Completing the process, not arresting it, if not making it turn about in the void, not assigning it a goal. We must never go too far within, this is back to the accelerationists in a sense, with the deterritorialization, the decoding of flow. For the new earth, in truth, the earth will one day become a place of healing. It's not to be found in the neurotic or the perverse reterritorializations that arrest the process or assign a goal. It is no more behind than ahead. It coincides with the completion of the process of desiring production. This process that is always and already complete as it proceeds and as long as it proceeds. It therefore remains for us to see how effectively, simultaneously, these various tasks of schizoid analysis take. Okay, so this is then continued, as you know, in somewhat 1,000 plateaus and in writings that they do in terms of regime of madness and schizoid analysis. But anyway, any comments about this? I know they leave us not with a concrete political program. I'm well aware of this, but at the same time, I'm not so sure this was their goal here. I think they're trying to set up a very different way of thinking about both libidinal economy and political economy together, right? To think about the Marx-Freud synthesis, if you will, in a very different way, no longer through Hegelian categories, no longer through the simplistic, synthetic activities that take place, that happened in the Frankfurt School and Erich Fromm and the humanistic psychoanalysis moments and, the client-based therapy of Rogers, all of these kind of moments that took place, the 1950s psychoanalysis of acculturation, around Horney, etc. I think all these things are stakes for them. So they're really, again, looking at the connective, the connective, the disjunctive, and the conjunctive always at work here, right? And anyway, so I want to hear from you. Obviously, there are other sections that are very good here, going back to some of the things they say. But I thought it would be, since we're always looking for what value does it have, what effect does a political effect does a work of this magnitude have for us, obviously, yes, it plays out in today, as Leslie has given us a good briefing from the west coast of Canada, and the young people who are attracted to this on different levels. This whole play of horizontalism, the open mic of Occupy Wall Street, right? The leaderless revolutions, right? Etc. That the young people are into. Capitalist realism, the defeatism that's out there, etc. So, yeah, what effects? And remember, this is almost 50 years ago. Yeah, we're revisiting this book. Bruno, Tony, and I heard the 20-year anniversary of Empire, but this is 28 years before Empire was published, in a complete generation beforehand. Yeah. And, and I see a lot in here that can be worked with, that we see in a lot of, especially the Italian schools, the better parts of the Italian school, of a philosophy that has come out of May of '68 and the hot autumn of '69 in Italy, etc. So yeah, I'd like to hear from people. I'm sorry to read so much, but I think it's important. The libidinal marks, if you rewrite this book in a sense, you could put libidinal marks, capitalism and schizophrenia or something like that. Or, the Oedipus is, to me, a kind of a foil of narrative here in a way. Yeah, the serious stuff is going well beyond this, in a sense. It becomes a signifier that is part of a narrative, in which happens to be a signifier again for signifying something else, which is closed representation, holy familialism, all of these things are there. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
So, well,
So what's in the chat here? Tony, you said something? Or someone
I'm
said?
just responding to Matt, who said
Oh, okay.
there was some book about the Zapatistas and Deleuze and Guattari. But actually,
Okay.
I saw here, just in that passage you read, again, the point that they repeat a few times about avoiding goals and having no aims, right?
Right.
And to me, it sounds like it's like this way. I mean, in our time, it sounds like this strategy for how to become illegible, right, as a subject or whatever to power. Like how to make it so we can't be read, which I guess echoes something Josh said earlier about the right.
Mm-hmm.
Should I repeat it? I mean, right, Josh?
No, definitely. I was
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to say, and it's been, I mean, tremendously throughout this appreciated the voice of political economy through Carl and biology and all of that, and of course David is kind of a resident Freud and understanding the complexities and the humility of Freud. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about Freud, is he always was humble before the unconscious, if you will, and always the revisions. And this was the object before them, right? That they were always constantly revising, and the models would change, and the structures, and you had all the conflicts within the movement. I think they're trying to get outside of this box, if you will. Whether it's successful or not is another story, but I think it's a very good attempt. And I think what Tony brought up, this is about process without a name and without a goal. Mm-hmm. In many ways, we're very, very teleologically oriented. In a way, this is the philosopher that I'm reminded of here that is really present, that's not really mentioned, is Whitehead. I really think people should reread Process and Reality of Alfred North Whitehead. It's pretty amazing how close Deleuze is to him, and vice versa. That dialogue is pretty amazing. And the emphasis upon Nietzschean, process too. Nietzsche lurks behind this always. Whether or not we want a Nietzschean politics is another story, because part of the problem there is the fascist pole is very active, very, very active in that regard. And we have to be extremely aware of that. Yes, sir, Carl. Yeah.
Well, this is you know,
Yeah.
relating to something Lydia said last week that I found, you know, interesting.
Lydia's an empty signifier, but anyway, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think she's here. We just see
Yeah,
the
yeah, okay.
we see a lit window with
Yeah,
a
yeah,
lamp.
yeah. She's like Tony Negre on Monday.
There she is.
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, good,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
So
Okay.
you know that you know what the way to read the book is that it's essentially performing schizoanalysis, and I think that I read it differently, but I think that that's, you know, certainly one way we could, you know, in the end interpret this is that they're sort of demonstrating what they're talking about. It's perform. I guess the word that came to my mind as I was thinking about is that it's performative in a certain way. It's not an argument. It's not attempting to explain anything, but it's a kind of a performative.
Why would you use the adjective performative when they are against theatrical representation throughout? What are they
Well,
performing?
I
mean, that's really the question, right? Because that's what they're trying to avoid completely. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm more responding to, you know, what Lydia was saying, that, you know,
Okay.
that essentially what they're doing is that they are, you know, they're going through these, you know, recurrent cycles of, you know, delirium in a certain way. They're demonstrating delirium. And, you know, again, I guess just for me, you know, this section you read, the task of schizoanalysis is ultimately that of discovering for every case the nature of the libidinal investments in the social field, their conflicts, their relationships to preconscious investments, and their possible conflicts with these. And, you know, like, I guess, you know, again, I feel like I'm sort of, you know, repeating myself, but if I was to be, you know, like when you read that, I was thinking, well, if I wanted to be a good schizoanalyst here and actually go out and do this, you know, how would I do that? How would I sort of like take up that task? And I don't know, like, I don't feel like I have read anything in the book that particularly equips me to do that, other than to just sort of engage in my own delirium, right? To sort of like, I mean, that's ultimately where I feel like I could go with that. And if I wanted to like talk in a more argumentative way about why is it that at this moment in history, the right wing is resurgent, I don't think I would draw on what they have laid out. I think I would have to go other places.
Well, for example, where would you go? Since this seems to be one question of why do people desire, you know, I mean, again, I think there's a crucial distinction here being made between desire and interest, right?
I would, so
throughout this book. So why do people, you know, desire what is ultimately not in their best interest? It might be in their class interest for the ruling class, but why do we have, yeah. What is this about?
I think I would start more with Karl Polanyi, who's not, you know, been mentioned in the context of this class, but wrote the book The Great Transformation. And, you know, in that book, and in some sense, he is implying the exact opposite of what they are suggesting of, you know, the more radical deterritorialization. That what he argues is that capitalism and the market society treats everything as a commodity. And he uses the term the fictitious commodities, with which he means labor, power, and nature. And he says that they're fictitious because they're not themselves produced as commodities, but they're treated as such within capitalism. And this involves a fundamental contradiction. In fact, what Deleuze and Guattari are arguing, this kind of decoding the deterritorialization, is what destroys the fabric of life. And that the advent of the market, so the destruction of certain frameworks that put limits on the market, has certain existential and psychological consequences and social consequences that are so disruptive that at that point, so Polanyi is trying to explain fascism. He is trying to explain why the right was so ascendant at a particular time, you know. And so I think I would say, I'm not saying that he has either the right answers, but his.
Well, in the same family, the brother was on the right.
Right, but where he leads is much more to the kind of direction I think that Marxist ecological thinking is going, and I think a certain kind of feminist thinking is going, is more almost like, how do we reinstate certain protective mechanisms and move beyond commodification? We don't need more commodification. We need to, and in some sense, Deleuze and Guattari are almost arguing that we need more, that we just haven't commodified enough, that we need to just have technology. And you could interpret
This I don't understand. Where do you see that in the text that we need more?
because what we need is more decoding. What we need is more deterritorialization. We need to sort of accelerate the process. I mean, you could argue that they're trying to push the whole system beyond its limits into kind of the schizo realm. And Polanyi would go in exactly the opposite direction and say that what we need is the protective mechanisms and to decommodify labor and to decommodify nature and to radically transform. So I'm just saying, like, that might be my starting point.
Well, I don't think they're advocating for the continued extraction of nature, extraction of resources, or any of the
I take that back.
or exploitation. I think that fundamentally that this is all presupposed throughout the book. I mean, in a sense, I don't see how we get to the point of where they're commodifying anything here. I think again, looking at mechanisms.
I retract that statement. That was a little bit rhetorical, but they are arguing. They are arguing against territorialization and against coding, and you could argue that what we need is different kinds of territorialization. Now,
they're arguing against representation. That's what they're really arguing against at bottom, because the system is a closed representation. Right. If you think about how you're raised, what you do, how you choose a career, how you go through all these things, the hoops you go through, the steps, etc., it is a kind of closed representation in many ways, right? And there's very little space for invention, etc. This is one of the reasons we like in the 50s the anti-hero, and then we have a different notion of the Dylans of the 1960s. We have a different notion of the 70s and the punks and all these things, because they're attacking something that we know all too well, right? That we are closed in, if you will, right, by these forms of representation that are accompanied by moments of state capitalism, state regulation of capitalism, whatever you want to call it. The America's back instead of make America great again, etc. We have all these codes that are going on. So I think yes, of course they're against territorialism, and in a way they're against deterritorialization, even though they understand it as part of the process. They're looking at both hands here. That movement is really what they're dealing with. I don't think they're only about deterritorialization ultimately. And I think they would agree. I mean, certainly Guattari, listen, again, this work is taken up and these people are friends. This is why I'm suspicious of saying that they're just thinking only abstractly and outside. They're taking up about some of the most militant labor people, in the 1970s. I mean, this is taken up by an extremely strong group of militant people. The why work moment, zero work people in Italy. In France, you have a whole group of people that followed this. Going forward. So in some ways, I think that it has many resonations in a way. And I love Polanyi. And by the way, speaking of deterritorialization, his grandson is a street musician in Montreal, right? Anyway, so so it goes to show you, yeah, sometimes the great transformation, yeah. But
I think if I was to try and this is again, outside my realm, but I think for me, the question of desire is, I think that capitalism does produce a sense of desire as lack, and it, I think that to try and understand that process more. I mean, I know that a lot of people have done work on that. So
yeah.
But it seems to me that they're trying to understand that structure and how that structure is produced, and then if you produce lack in people who are experiencing a lot of insecurity, material insecurity, it seems that those two things, give rise to a tendency towards authoritarian
They're not coming out of that school of Marxism with
No,
scarcity.
I know.
They're not coming out of that school. This is a school that comes out of the Collège de Sociologie with Georges Bataille and company, the Cursed Share. It's about abundance, right? In a sense, it's not really about lack or that there's scarcity out there. This is not about a theory of need in a certain way, as we get with the Budapest School and Agnes Heller in the 70s. It's not about, and it's about not about that space between desire, then lack or the void and need that Lacanians think through at some levels, right? That kind of void. They're trying to get out of it. I'm not, again, please don't hear me as advocating fully for them. I just want us to understand what they're doing, and why in some ways it has a lot of potential. And it was taken up by some very, very, we were lucky enough to be in the presence. He didn't say anything. Lazzarato was at the move on Monday. Another person that I think learned tremendously from this book in terms of the making of indebted man, right? Et cetera. And in the recent book, Wars and Capital, where they're looking at different ways of looking at, what's going on globally in terms of capital, right? In a sense, outside of the old standard ways of the orthodoxy looking at. So in some ways, I don't find them to be, quote, anti-Freudian, right? In that way, in terms of the best of Freud. They're very, very much into this. They know this stuff. They speak about it later. They do think it's taken on a policing aspect. That policing aspect is really that of representational closure. They really are looking at this as a part of a closure. There's almost, in a sense, the metaphysics of psychoanalysis, its drive, if you will, or its positioning, its principles lead it to, representational closure. And that closure is, it's interminable. It'll go on infinitely. You're never finished, et cetera, right? In some ways, right? That this is, again, another thing that they're looking at, to talk about. And in the Orthodox, revolutionary circles and party organizations, the whole question of betrayal. Why did the movements end up stinking so bad, right? In so many ways, right? I mean, of course that's going to happen, but they're trying to analyze these mechanisms involved. I'm not saying they have the final answer or anything like that, but I think they pose radical questions. That to me is the important thing. Why is it that a Bukharin who's really ready to risk his life in 1917 is on the front line, is in the party hierarchy, is like a little baby at the show trial begging for forgiveness when he thinks completely the opposite? What produces this? And then you read Merleau-Ponty, you read the argument against Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon, you read Humanism and Terror, and you begin to think about what is terror, what is state terror, what happens in state terror when this happens. Look at a film, another great film on this is in the South American context, in the Latin American context, The State of Siege, which is Costa Stravas's masterpiece. Forget Z with Irene Pappas and, her great presence there. Think of State of Siege with Yves Montand, who plays a CIA operative, right? Who was basically interrogated. This is a very careful plane of immanence that's working in a sense. Linguistic codes, which unfolds very beautifully, I think, part of this process in a way, where there's a coming to consciousness of what he did. And then he sees the paradox of it. And that the delirium there in State of Siege and I hope people have seen these movies. I'm sorry to riff on the films, but it's a great film by Costa Stravas, Yves Montand, made in 1972 about the Uruguayan uprisings. Or the Uruguayan left and the kidnapping of an agent there, but anyway, so there's this very beautiful unfolding of all the mechanisms that produce this kind of delirium, and you see how the delirium in the Yves Montand character does not begin to side with the revolutionaries, right? Will not go over to their side, but the pole of fascism is so deep in his delirium, even though it's clear when it's unfolded, that anybody in quote unquote listening to themselves, undergoing this process would have said, yeah, I'm going to join forces with you. I see exactly what's going on. So I think they're really trying to go as deep as they can here. And another thing is too, is that I think they're advancing the hypothesis that, and this is Lacan in his early work in the 1930s in his dissertation, that capitalism is a paranoid machine, right? But it's able in that paranoia to re-territorialize and recollect and reframe everything on its own terms in many ways, right? I mean, again, I use this concept. I've been reading a lot of Lazzarato lately and some other people, even Michael Hudson of a different variety in political economy, that forced financialization is going on. All of us with 401ks or pension funds are helping to make Mr. Bezos and Mr. Gates, et cetera, and the hedge funds richer and richer every day, even though we partake with better returns, et cetera. But this is a question of interest once again, in terms of how the system works in many ways. So look how quickly they had to pull off the financial turnaround in 2008 and 2009. You want a revolution in the United States? Go after everyone's 401k. That they're going to lose their second home in the Catskills or in the Berkshire, and from New York City, or think about these kind of things. What kind of revolution you would have? Because the revolution from below, it's always misguided in a sense. It's very reactive. So I think they're giving keys here in a different way, to really think this through. What is the libidinal investment? What is the libidinal marks at work? This kind of merging, if you will, of politics and libido, right? In a sense, which seem to be very separate from, most of the orthodoxy in psychoanalysis. David, I see you're unmuted, and Bruno hasn't said anything, and anybody else, but please, David, go ahead.
I just had a very sort of specific question from the text part that you were reading, Michael, which is, they do say that it will be violent and brutal at one point, referring to the concept of change. Do they mean that literally? Is this for them a bit like saying literally like there will be a revolution and it will be a violent one, or do they mean it more in terms of an abstract sense of energetic processes that psychically are violent because they're so symbolically disruptive in the schizoidal?
I'll put this in their term. It's libidinal marks, right? It's both violent in terms of the psychic, but it's also violent in terms of the social. I have a feeling, I don't think Guattari was against any kind of possibility of violent uprisings. He was very involved in many of the liberation struggles and connected very actively to that, right? And it's like asking Fanon the same question, right? And asking Marx in a certain way too. Marx, never really wrote on psychic violence. He certainly understood it, but you have to remember it's the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. It is violent. So this is a perpetual question, obviously. But I think it's both.
This might be a little, off topic, but to go back to the conformist for a minute, why not? But
well, I'm off topic with many movies, so please.
Okay. But one of the things in that plot that has always seemed to me very poignant, and I remember having a professor who said this was symbolic of this, was Dominique Sand's love of the conformist's rather limited wife, where she is able to see great beauty in her, and in a sense falls in love with her in the strange triangle between them of him being fascinated by Dominique Sand's character but not being able to possess her, but her actually loving his wife even though she's simple because she sees her as a kind of force of the childlike good. Anyway, what this fellow who was critiquing the film had said, I'm curious if you'd agree, and maybe it relates here, was that he felt that the wife represented the kind of reduced, reified proletariat before the revolution happened, who was rather limited because they couldn't be awakened. She could not become conscious until she rebelled. And that was kind of Dominique Sand's character's moment as a kind of proto-Marxist figure of saying she could see her as she would become. she could see what she could transform into potentially. And part of the tragedy of the movie is that that love is not allowed to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting interpretation. I mean, I would take it, in some ways, Dominique Sanda is basically showing. I think her name is I forgot her name in the film. The petty bourgeois
Right,
woman, right?
right.
In
Yeah.
which you have that very perverse, recounting of the uncle that seduces her on the train. You remember that?
Yes.
And this is what turns on, Clergy, Jean-Louis Trinidad, hearing these stories of the uncle seducing, his wife, right, and her child, as a young woman. So anyway, the Dominique Sanda character, I think it's really about the seduction, in a way to show the cosmopolitanism of Paris, right? Taking her shopping. You remember there's long takes, these elegant scenes of the fashion, the Bergdorfs of Paris, whatever it was, Louis Vuitton or whatever, Chanel, houses. And in a way, she's doing that. But I think the seduction is more just to keep the mind, bring her in to the fold as a possibility. I'm not so sure that Dominique Sanda has love for this woman. I think it's more of a ploy. That's just my reading.
Interesting.
Because she ends up, where does she end up? She ends up as a kind of maid-like figure, right? In a dusty apartment after the war, right? She has no growth, right, without Dominique Sanda around, just as he has no growth either. In a way, Dominique Sanda is the seductress for both, right? And neither can take the seduction, right, in a sense, right? I mean, to my mind, that's kind of how I read that character, right, in some ways, right? Yeah.
They're both, in their way, untransformable.
Yes.
They remain immutable and trapped in this kind of trap, which is simplistic maybe, but it's a little bit like what Deleuze and Guattari are getting at, is their libidos are so disconnected from something, there's inertia, there's stasis.
Right. In that delirium, if you want to read the film through Deleuze and Guattari in terms of these two poles of desire, in that delirium, the delirium is taken up by Clergy, who is obviously taken by Dominique Sanda. There's so many hints towards this, and in fact, even relating to her, in fantasy as well, in the fascist, bureaucracy and the argument that there is this pole of, a paranoid fascism that takes over, that is very protective. It's safe in a way. That's another thing they don't really talk about in this, and to use the phrase that in a category in philosophy that Bruno likes, contingency. Deleuze and Guattari, they should really be talking about how safe it is to be on that pole of delirium, right? This is another thing that is really should be talked about today. Where's the safety, or what I would call the security principle? And I'm not against people being secure, especially ontologically. This would be a much better place in a sense. But in a way, they really don't talk about this in terms of, yes, the safety that fascism or the fascist pole or the paranoid activity offers, right, in a way, instead of the risk taking, that is required by the revolutionary pole, if you will. Yeah, he can't take a risk. He can't make a choice. Every time he gets close to it, he can't do it, right? Yeah. And then you look at, this is a brilliant, I think it's an amazing study upon retrospection. I mean, I saw it when I was very young and very struck by it. But anyway, and I hope people see it and have seen it in the room. Sorry to dwell on it, but I think it's remarkable in the sense that it gives you a study really of the character that we face every day. The mindless, characterless bureaucrat, the office worker, the one that had the great class once upon a time in philosophy, but forgot everything about it, right, etc., cannot practice it, etc., and all of this. And then the inability to take a risk, to take risks, that you become so secure, so immersed in one's everyday practices that you can't step out. And I think in everyday language, just in simplified language, this is one thing that they're talking about on this fascistic pole that takes place, that the delirium is so overwhelming, or the overwhelming anxiety. If you want to read this in terms of, I mean, one text of Freud that I would read alongside this is Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, right? In terms of this delirium and what's going on and the overwhelmingness. And, how this overwhelmingness is translated back into safety. And this is part of that pole that they're against. And it's all too easy to go back, lie on the couch. I think they're fighting this as well, right? They want the walk to happen. They want the peripatetic risk to happen, the schizoid on a stroll or something like that. If that makes sense. I mean, I think this is, it's interesting. The conformist is a great, I think it's a great psychological study. And you could look at this. Remember, it's made 2 years before this book is published. 1970 is its release.
Interesting.
Yeah. State of Siege is 72. The pandemic has allowed me the time, with lack of other things to do, to watch all the movies that I used to really love in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I started with the American, film noir all the way up to, I'm going back and I want to recommend Bruno turned me on to Tony of Jean Renoir, which is a very beautiful film about migration and maybe in a sense deterritorialization as well, right? Yeah, you want to say anything about that? I mean, since we're talking about Bruno might go to the movies here and David, right?
Yeah, in particular about that, no, I mean, it's a great movie. I mean, maybe this happens often when you watch, I hadn't watched it before, and you said this is the best movie I have ever watched. And then I don't know if that is true, but it's amazing.
I'm sorry?
Tony.
That's the best movie ever watched.
Who made it? Tony?
I didn't say Jean Renoir. Yeah, I didn't.
Jean Renoir. Yeah, by
it's
Jean
a great
Renoir.
film. It's a great film, but it's
that's what you mentioned, no?
No, I didn't say it was the greatest. No, I said it's a.
No. I said you asked me if I wanted to say something. I said,
oh yeah.
No, when I watched it, I had that reaction. Now I don't know if that's true.
Oh, okay. I'll go back and read it then in that light.
Yeah, I just thought, oh wow, this is so wonderful because it is but I don't know if I want to say anything about the movie per se.
No, it's okay. I just thought
amazing.
Along with David brought up too, and I don't know, David, if that makes some kind of sense to you about the conformist in a way to read Deleuze and Guattari in that regard, that you see as a symbol there the anti-phallocratic, who is really the revolutionary figure in the film. I don't read the professor, as the radical figure. Of course, he's the one. That's the Fourth International Section in Paris that's in exile from Italy, et cetera. These are actual historical moments that Bertolucci is very well aware of. And but I find Dominique Sanda to be she's the revolutionary figure.
Yeah, right.
I thought she is the desiring.
Right. Bruno, Carl, I was curious, a few sessions back, you had said you wanted to give thought to, as a political economist, the phenomenon of the rise of Trumpism, the events of January 6th, that why this seems to have gone so wayward, they want to hang the wrong person. Now, of course, this is being blotted out by a revisionist history by Republicans who say it was just a day of tourism at the Capitol. It was not anything different than that, although obviously we have the film footage we do. We have Officer Falcone with the body camera showing himself being almost smashed to death. There's all this fakeness to it. Having now come to the end of Schizoanalysis, or close to it, do you feel like there is something in this book that for you helps explain this phenomenon?
No.
No,
not really. I mean, although I think I feel at this point like I almost want to go back through it because there's so much in the book, and I've been trying to read it very closely and look at the themes of the family, and I mean I think they say some very interesting things, and I think that they talk about. I mean, there was this one passage I loved where they talk about what do they call it, a necrophiliac machine, or how we come to desire images and images are dead, and that how that they're so. To me, I am kind of a structuralist thinker in the sense like I want to understand sort of the mechanisms, like how does it work? How is the individual psyche embedded in the family? How is the family embedded in the larger system? And I think that they, raise a lot of, points to look, but ultimately no. Like I ultimately come to the end of this, and again, if I want to explain, Trumpism, for instance, or Bolsonaro, I don't I don't think I would start here. I again would start more with or trying to understand like, racism. I
Right.
mean, why, tribalism? Like, there's clearly, I don't think we really understand
But
racism. I
in
think from a
fairness,
political economic standpoint, like I've even thought about trying to do some work on this of trying to bring, a Marxian analysis back into our understanding of race. You could make the argument that capitalism produces inequality, it produces scarcity. And
Right.
so people are going to be poor in capitalism, and then the question becomes who's poor,
Mhm.
right? So you can argue that it's not just about, race, that there's actually a structure that then becomes racialized in this
Mm.
society. But I don't think that really gets us to the point of like what is happening inside our psyches. Why does blackness become this such a symbol,
Mhm.
or how does that become
but
invested?
for them, it's not inside.
Mhm.
Right, but
That's
how
the
does
point. It's not the inside at all. We think too much in internal terms here. For them, it's the outside. That's why desiring production once again. And in a way, I think they are dealing with the racial unconscious in a
Yeah,
lot of ways. In
Fanon especially, right?
Days of Delirium. Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Fanon
Fanon is
especially, yeah.
throughout this book. I
The whole
mean,
book is
yeah,
about Fanon, really.
yeah, it really, in some ways, is the Anti-Oedipus is really Frantz Fanon speaking to the psychoanalytic community in France,
Mhm.
about national liberation struggles and how the Senegalese feels when he sees the beautiful Parisian woman walk by and snub him and acts like he's inhuman, right?
Mhm.
This is, there are many clinical studies of this that are going on, how this happened in
Mhm.
this section, and then how these people are quarantined and sectored off in Paris, the banlieue, how it's formed and all these things. So I think this is very much here. I mean, the Frantz Fanon is playing out very actively here, even though they don't say we follow Fanon here, we follow Fanon there. I think it's very, very implicit. I don't know, Josh, you want to say something about this
No, I
since
mean,
you?
just when I was reading the Black Skin, White Mask, I mean, I was just surprised how many sections were almost, I mean, they weren't verbatim, but the ideas were all almost laid out in a very the same way,
So,
essentially. You can
so
point to sections specifically on Oedipus and Black, and in the Black experience and in the colony. I mean, there are just so many sections of that book that I just feel like I reread reading this Anti-Oedipus essentially. But there was one other thing I wanted to bring up too, because like this whole idea of uh, kind of a political program or a political moment or a revolutionary moment. I mean, as in my mind, and when you were talking about security again, Michael, I was thinking about just the idea of the swerve. I know, we talked about this in the pre-Socratic, and there's also Althusser with the swerve too. And
The aleatory materialism, the Epicurean.
exactly, yeah. I
Okay.
feel like this kind of has like a similar kind of resonance in a sense,
Sure.
like that who knows what will happen if we just have enough schizoids basically in the world, essentially, and it just takes a few to sort of change the whole course of history in a way. That's just one other thought I had, going back to the earlier point.
so let me pose it like this is a question, to Joshua and Michael, or anybody, like, which kind of gets at, I think, the question David is asking me. And this is not a rhetorical question. But how would you use Deleuze and Guattari to explain why white people in the US vote for Donald Trump and align with a racial, a nationalist, ethnic, white interest, when they're voting for, I mean, I'm saying the obvious, they're instating the people who have fucked them over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, like this is like the oldest question in some sense, you know, is like, why do people do this? Why?
Well,
I
again,
think,
I would read this in terms of intensities, because a lot of people feel that he wasn't fucking them over. And a lot of people thought that he was bringing back something that they had lost a long time ago, because they're trained this way. They don't want to hear about, you know, the rights of transgendered people that pervades the media. They don't want to go the way of, you know, the progress that certain groups have made. They don't want to. Yeah.
right?
Because they're invested. They're
Right. And if
this is the great majority of people. Yeah. Yeah. They don't know. Yeah.
But
Go
that
ahead.
sounds kind of ideological, Michael. That sounds like,
I don't know if it's ideological.
Going to the level of ideology, and they're saying ideology, but they're saying ideology is not it. They're saying it's a different level. It's not about, you know, the ideological production of consensus. They're not Gramscians. They're not, you know, that's they're not Althuserians in that way. I think they're going for a very different, you know, understanding of things. And again, I'm not asking. I mean, I'm sympathetic to what they're trying to do, but to go back to what David said, you know, does this really help me understand why somebody goes into a voting booth, a white guy who's been laid off?
Well, I mean, does it explain why people vote for Joe Biden?
Right, but his
Joe Biden saying that say what he had to, you know, what he does too. I mean, basically, this is a history of targeted assassinations, et cetera, and it's going to a perfect foil that the ruling class has put up. You know, in a way, listen, I'm not crazy about where Glenn Greenwald going on Tucker Carlson, but if you go to look at Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Monti's criticism of Democracy Now!, they have a very good point about the left at this point. Everybody was part of the Trump binary. Get Trump out, get Trump out. Never really understood beyond that. This is a real question to my mind, in a sense. It's not so much only about, quote unquote, the fascist or the white supremacist. It's also about the bad faith of the liberal, which is also very much active in this position, which is just as much an enemy, and even more so because it parades as progressive in a certain way. Yeah. Anyway, Bruno, why don't you say I had you say?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say I was thinking of this already, but it fits really the discussion now. That there is this important question about the reduction of everything to need, rather than desire. So desire, and when they speak toward the end of the book, and you read it today, Michael, they speak about real desire, right? The positing of the production of desire, producing desire, and the production of real desire. And one may say, I don't know, I just, I just say it now, but I'm not sure, but that perhaps desire cannot really be non-revolutionary, right? Because then it's something different. I mean, now an example, what you're talking about, maybe we can say that that's not an analysis of what, but people voting for Trump or for even Biden, right? The less evil and so on and so forth. They always do that on the basis of, it's always predicated on need and not on desire. I don't know if this is clear, but I was reading I was reading in Achille and Bembe that I still am finishing, right? There is a section, wonderful, when he speaks of, at one point, then he goes into Fanon. I mean, Fanon is there throughout. And the question of desire is there. And he speaks of Marcus Garvey, and makes a very interesting distinction between need and desire. Actually, Mbembe says that Garvey was always careful not to reduce desire to need, right? So, and what he does, of course, I mean, then that may still be problematic in other ways, but the question that he says, speaking about this, he speaks of the desire to govern oneself. That's the desire that ultimately moves Marcus Garvey. And he also speaks about this idea of inventing a desire. So a desire is not simply, and it cannot be ultimately perhaps what I do, because that's servitude. That's precisely, in a sense, right, one of the things that we are discussing, you know, accepting a situation of, I mean, one doesn't accept, I mean, it's not voluntary, but the passionate servitude even comes about when, and that's maybe also there is an ideological moment, but when I am, when someone is able to persuade me that, and that's interest also that Michael, you were speaking about, interest in that narrow sense, not in the sense of being in between, being among things, right? But when someone really persuades me that unless I do X, I lose my livelihood and so on and so forth, maybe I will do it. But do I desire it? Really? Maybe not. Maybe I don't know, even I don't even know how to invent a desire, how to produce desire. I'm completely outside the paradigm of a delirium and of a desire. And they say, look, and actually, Michael, because you mentioned the film Tony by Jean Renoir that we were speaking about, I said, you know, there isn't anything I want to say, but now that I think of it, Tony, great movie, the main character acts and he ruins ultimately himself, and he, you know, dies, but he acts on the basis of a desire, which is an irrational. What he does is ultimately, if you will, in the realm of precisely delirium, a dream. Let's put it this way. And I want to say two more things only. One is maybe for those practicing psychoanalysis, because I don't know Freud very much, but can it be said that maybe if there is a relation to Freud here is perhaps a move away from the reality principle and toward the pleasure principle again? Question number one. And the other one maybe for, I like what Tony said before about being becoming illegible, right? You said that, I mean, if you want to say more about that, but the idea, because ultimately this is what they are, I mean, and they say there is no political program whatsoever in schizoanalysis, right? They say that toward, you read it, Michael, earlier, toward the end of the book, but there is evidently a way of practicing something, right, which is at that level of the schiz, the delirium, and so of becoming illegible, of withdrawing from the machinery of docility and obedience, which is the machinery of servitude, right? So, and the machinery of control. And that's very important actually today, because if one is really able, and if many, and the fragments and so on, to become illegible, then, and I don't know how, but you know, that remains to be seen, that would be, that, yes, then that would become political in the deep, perhaps even ontological sense, okay? Yeah. So, I mean, in any case, I said, and then the two ways, yes.
I'm gonna go on to Steve, he's had his hand up a long time. So, yeah, Steve, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment because the more political subject came up, you know, around January 6th and all that. Just to throw in my observation, you know, the one part of, you know, political activism I've been involved in somewhat is, you know, what you'd call the environmental movement, I guess, and it just seems to me that the biggest lost opportunity in the whole Earth movement or environment movement, whatever you want to call it, is it's lost its connection with desire. I've learned a great deal from reading this book. I think Deleuze and Guattari have great insight here. I mean, I think so many people within the environmental movement don't understand how much they are disliked by people who are outside the movement, because people who identify as environmentalists spend so much of their time telling people what they can't do. You know, watch your carbon footprint. You know, recycle your trash. You shouldn't drive such a big car. You know, all of these are gestures in and of themselves, but the problem is that it's a movement that's been so focused upon repressing people's impulses, and it's a movement that's lost its connection, I think, with people's desire for a better life. So I just wanted to throw that in, that I think Deleuze and Guattari have great insight there about what goes into a successful movement and how it can fail. I just wanted to contribute that.
Just got to take up two things real quickly. I mean, Bruno again mentioned everyday life. I think the Foucault introduction again is very good. This is a book that helps us maybe in some ways heal, get back in touch with what Steve said, you know, the question of desire. We've lost that. We're a very need-based society. We really believe in all this stuff about everything's commodified, etc. We don't really think that through. In a sense, we don't. And you think about this too, the time this book is written, you know, 2-3 years earlier, you know, the storming of the courts, Jonathan Jackson goes in an overcoat to the San Marin courthouse and, you know, opens his trench coat and says there's no justice in this country. And he's loaded with machine guns. He's shot down. But that's a question of revolutionary desire at work. I'm not advocating for that, but it's a very different approach than going to the Capitol where we saw. You know, if you had 100 Jonathan Jacksons storming the Capitol, you would have seen open fire by every Capitol Guard there, including the National Guard called out immediately, the Washington Police Force. So in a sense, there is something about revolutionary desire that goes on. And I think we have to also think about one of the antagonists here is not especially the psychoanalyst per se as an entity or as a practitioner or the clinical, but it's really the notion of the cop, the policing of the society. These are people that are very much, and you know, I relate this story again. I think I told you, you know, that one thing we're going to open this text on techniques of servitude. Tito Gerasi, who was a friend of Sartre, they're outside the police precinct in one of the major the left bank in Paris in 1968 in May, end of May or early June. And the students have already taken the police headquarters and the workers. And of course, Sartre says, well, aren't you going to destroy all the files? Oh, no, we can't do that. So Sartre turned to Gerasi and said, the movement is over, right? Because if you can't confront the cop, right? The cop in all of us, right? This is another thing that they're trying to take away. The desire, you know, is really, when it's translated into need only, becomes the cop, the check on us. And I agree with Bruno too. This is about a rewriting of the pleasure principle, like Marcuse tries earlier in Eros and Civilization, you know, to privilege the pleasure principle and to rewrite the reality principle in some ways, in terms of, you know, that's the emphasis upon the need structure of everyday life, in a sense. Yeah. I mean, I read to you what the Accelerationists are quoting John Maynard Keynes on the 3-hour day in 1930. By a bourgeois liberal economist, right? One of the, you know, the neo-Keynesian moment, which is completely unheard of today. A racist judge turned one of the best Supreme Court judges, Hugo Black, is arguing for the 35-hour week and guaranteed income during the 1930s. Where are we? I mean, this is a real question we have to do. Or is the cop in our head dictating so much to us, you know, in so many ways? And I see this play out everywhere. You know, like I said, in the union struggles, need is on the table always. What are my wages? What are my benefits? When am I getting my raise? Nobody talks about the transformation of the curriculum, the transformation of the classroom. You know, how do you make it more productive for students? Nobody speaks this way. It's spoken about a little bit in articles, but never in the struggle on the ground. So you have to ask this question. What has happened, as Steve Knight mentioned, in a way, this book reorients us in some ways. One of the reasons it's worth reading it is it reorients, I think, the question of desire, you know, really in a very, very fundamental way. And I think they're trying something here very radically different. Again, it's something that we can take little things from. You don't have to be an adherent. I mean, I don't believe in this kind of cultish, schismatic tendencies on the left, that show I'm Deleuzian, I'm Guattarian, I'm Lukácsian, I'm Althusserian, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, we're in a moment in history where we're eclectic, we're commentators, we're trying to think beyond where we are, in a sense. So for me, it has the value that way, in a sense.
I definitely think, that,
Yeah.
one thing that is, I totally agree with is, some of, the critiques, I don't know if Glenn Greenwald has specifically critiqued democracy now, or, those, but there is, definitely, and what Steve
No, I
was
mean, they have a nice concept. It's not the critique itself. I think it's the concept that you can work with. It's the Trump binary. This is part of what goes on. We had the Goldwater binary back in the 60s. We had the Nixon binary in the 70s, right? Think about the binaries that we were looking at. The Reagan binary. Look at all these moments that we've been faced with just in our own lifetimes, much less the binaries in history.
I think that,
in a way, they're really trying to think outside. I think they're good at this in a way, and this is worth taking up from the book, and especially for those people that are practicing in the clinic, that are doing clinical work, that the double bind that is going on here, they're really trying to think outside that. It's very interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting.
I have a question,
sure.
To sort of refer it back to David and Lydia and Jane. I mean, I'd be very interested in hearing what you feel after, having read this book about, does it make you reflect upon clinical practice? Does it make you see, I mean, I'm just, curious, like if I was a practicing analyst, I don't know how I'd react to the book, but I'm just curious in terms of just, the actual practice of therapy, and what, or do you see it as sort of in a totally different realm?
Lydia, I feel I sometimes speak before you do, and I think you have a lot to say. So I was going to,
I just basically, I agree with the basic critique that psychoanalysis is fundamentally pacifist. I guess that the best that Freud could hope for us was that, our impulses become sublimated to social normative causes, right, functioning, and that's insufficient. You don't have to be a revolutionary to think that that's insufficient for humans. So I have a friend who claims to be a schizoanalyst who has a practice in New York City, and I don't know how he's doing. Like he has clients and they are responsive. They must be a little bit intellectually self-aware about what they're going for with that. So yeah, that's all I have at the moment.
I would just say, in this way, which is, I don't mean this as a critique of the book. I think it's fascinating and complicated, and I don't feel I fully understand it at this point, despite Michael's best efforts and a great class. I mean, it's just complicated stuff if you're not that well versed in it. But the thing I don't feel they do, it's just not their thing. They don't really propose anything that's really a kind of a challenge to technical practice of analysis. Like, there's not something that you'd find in a neo-Kleinian like Betty Joseph or someone like this who would say you should really interpret aggression more directly, or you should be doing this more, or there's an actual practical way that what you do as an analyst would be changed. That's just not their thing. I would say overall, this isn't so new. I mean, the baroqueness of their thinking, the specifics of what they're saying are things I'm unfamiliar with, but the idea of going beyond, which I think is part of their message, some kind of simplicity that analysis would ultimately promote a kind of heterogeneity or conformity, or would be totally seen only with a particularly reified set of concepts like the Oedipal concept or castration. I don't feel that's so new. I mean, I do think most modern psychoanalysis has been informed by that for quite some time. I mean, some people, more so than others, depending on how original or open to thought that they are. But I think that the part of Freud that, again, I don't think they kind of take seriously enough, amongst a few different things, is the concept of the purified pleasure ego, which I personally find very interesting because Freud writes about it in numerous ways, but it's the idea of the part of the mind that creates so much pleasure and is so conflict-free that the person is willing to give everything else away. So, the purified pleasure ego is, active for someone who's, say, addicted to something. It might not be heroin, but it might even just be a behavior or having an orgasm all the time. And, that the purified pleasure ego becomes so intense, it kind of creates a discharge release that replaces thought. It also, in some ways, might promote a psychotic process of the person, and I think this explains QAnon, of saying there's too much tension. The minds of these people who are involved with QAnon can't get that, so they get lost in the purified pleasure ego of saying, but it feels good. It feels so fucking good to storm the Capitol, and you can dress up like a soldier man, and you can get your gun, and you can feel phallic potency, and you can go break some heads, and you're going to get so much pleasure. You're going to get so much pleasure. But you aren't really thinking. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Donald Trump really isn't your friend. He's not doing anything for you. They can't see that. And I think they flirt a little bit with the idea of how seductive disconnecting from reality and the socius is, but I don't feel they quite go far enough there in respecting an aspect of Freud that is not so opposed to actually what they're positing in some way. And I find that very interesting as a clinician because I think sooner or later, a patient, even a very kind of well-organized neurotic, is usually confronted with the part of the mind that does have some engagement with the purified pleasure ego in some way that shifts or affects their ability to process reality. It may result in a fetish. It may result in a style of thinking where there's a certain kind of concreteness or a kind of a blind spot. And I think that their work would be more complete if they kind of got to that. And that's, something that's kind of not really happening, but I think that that's kind of an interesting aspect of where psychoanalysis can go and the challenge of how it can work outwards, where if we look at someone who's more benign than they are, Hans Lowell, the former student of Heidegger's, had the idea that the purified pleasure ego could become more pleasurable if things go well, if in the process of differentiation, there's pleasure in the idea of thinking that plays with reality, shapes reality, that the person feels part of the pleasure they have isn't that they're in this stuck world, which I sort of feel is a little overloaded by Deleuze and Guattari, that you're in the stuck world and all this shit is coming at you and you've got to deal with it and it's a schizoidal socialist. But more the idea that there's more play, ideally, in the environment you'd be in. This idea also appears for someone like D.W. Winnicott, the great pediatrician analyst, of saying if you're in a healthier environment, your inner pleasure, the fantasies and thoughts you have, might actually become, in some ways, real, capable of shaping an impact on the world that you're in. And if that happens before you get super frustrated, the impact wouldn't be throwing a brick. It might be painting the Sistine ceiling, or writing Remembrance of Things Past, or writing Schizoanalysis.
It's not my dog, so I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, but the pure pleasure, yeah, the dog. Jane, do you want to say anything, or you're cool, or what's yeah. Yeah, since Carl posted to all three, right? Yeah.
I would have to think it through a little bit more.
Okay, good. All right.
I will also add that
sure.
the branch of psychoanalysis that I study is called modern psychoanalysis, and it's inspired by schizophrenia as the baseline human condition, not neurosis. And so its view is that if you can treat a schizophrenic, you can treat anyone, and that the fundamentally what schizophrenia is aggression. toward the self. So the mind is split by aggression that can't be received by loved ones. And so instead of loving, that either becomes rage directed outward, inward, but it's just sort of a basic psychic dynamic, and it's not libidinally understood. It's understood to be aggression.
That seems to not accord with their notion that the molecular unconscious is essentially structured as a kind of a schizophrenic process. I mean, it seems like they're very different.
So classical Freudian understanding of schizophrenia and any narcissistic or really primal condition is that anything that seems narcissistic is libidinal investment in the self. There's too much love, too much free love, and interest in the schizophrenic was actually at the time how it was understood, but it isn't necessarily understood that way any longer.
Yeah, good. Steve, you had your hand up again? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really do appreciate, that the members of this group who work with some part of the psychoanalytic field have made over the past few weeks. I've learned a lot from them, but at the same time, at least as I say, this is a book that goes far beyond just questions of psychoanalysis, and with thinking that's applicable to many other fields. And I really get the sense that much of the argument is framed in psychoanalytic terms because that was Guattari's field, and so that came naturally to him in particular. But the real inspirations, I think, behind this book are not the psychoanalysts. I think they're the artists. I think it's the Artaud, the Beckett, Burroughs, D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller. I get the sense that those are the real guiding spirits behind this book. Just kind of throwing my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm certainly in agreement with that. I'll take up Freud's dictum, before the poets, we must lay down our arms. So I think they took that very seriously, in terms of the artists. I thought the section on Tintoretto and Venetian capitalism was brilliant towards the end. Again, in the height of capital, they go back to a painter in Venice, in Venetian capitalism towards the end. Another brilliant reading. Their attempts with Bosch, with Hieronymus Bosch, also very good, in a sense. So yeah, I mean, I'm with Steve on this too. I just want to make a remark about Freud, at least to my mind. I consider Freud to be a complete revolutionary of the mind. I agree that this is a Copernican turn, the discoveries that he makes. This is complete revolutionary of the mind. In another way, in the social field, he's a radical conservative. He's very pessimistic in Civilization and Its Discontents, the metapsychological work. He was friends with Romain Rolland, by the way, who came up with the phrase, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, that Gramsci is fond of quoting. He had things to say about communism and the Russian Revolution, that were never really over affirmative. He considered it a social experiment, but never was, affirmative about that, and saying this is the way to go. And I'm not saying that is the way. Please don't hear me that way either. But, in some ways, there's a really deep, and I'm not saying conservatism in a bad sense. I'm talking about something that is not interested in a complete transformation of society, maybe a better society and a better coping ability and a better, ability to live life, and a freer life, etc. Yes, I thought that was always the goal. But in terms of the revolutionary transformation of society and thinking through, as Marx would think, prehistory, species being in the early Marx, the theoretician of the senses that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, et cetera. I don't think this is present, to be honest with you. This is one of the reasons you had the people such as Marcuse, intervene, Norman O'Brown, and then of course, Deleuze and Guattari. I think they're part of a pattern here, in different ways of rewriting. Freud. So I just wanted to throw that in. And again, I think also if we take away that in some ways this is another way of also incorporating Nietzsche into the dialogue. Not that it's a Nietzschean politic at the end. It's a very suspect term in a lot of ways. But, it is about creditor-debtor relationships in history and the whole notion of the formation of the superego and guilt and culture that is really at stake here too, that they seem to be going through very rigorously throughout the work. So I think this is another very important aspect of this book. There's meta levels and there's also and I agree with David. I mean, we don't know what this would play out later. And in Lydia, giving us the insight that there's a schizoanalysis, a schizoid-analysis practice in the tri-state area. I'm sure there are plenty in California, but anyway, I think, again, I don't know what clinical resonation this has, but in a way, what it does force us to do is, I hope, think beyond need and to reframe the question of desire in a radically different way, in some ways, even if we think alongside Freud or we've misread Freud, because I think Lacan, in some ways, his great contribution was to return to Freud. As David has done brilliantly throughout these meetings, to return to Freud and say, this is what he's thinking after all these distortions. This is what he really meant. Let's take this, etc. This, to me, was the beauty of Lacan. Lacan used to say, I'm not Lacanian, etc. I mean, I'm sure he promoted the cult around him, but anyway, at the same time, he said, I'm a Freudian. That's what he always said, about his practice. And, this was, someone that was, absolutely interested in the political moment of psychoanalysis. Just read Shirley Turkle, who he got in trouble, who got her into trouble later. I don't know if you know the story about Shirley. She was there in '68. She wrote a book called Psychoanalytic Politics. She's a sociologist. She's at MIT. She invited Lacan when she came back to the States. This is actually a very good book about the time of '68 in Paris and the relationships to Lacan. Turkle is her last name, Sherry Turkle. Anyway, she wrote a book, Home Alone, the second self, and the relationship of the kids to machines, the first, computer generation, if you will, wedded to the machines. But anyway, she invited Lacan to give a talk at MIT in 1975. And Lacan came and he gave a lecture about elephant shit. That elephants took up the least amount of space on the earth. They shit where they are, right? And this was the talk. So, of course, you can imagine at MIT, they never forgave her. This was in, these departments. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So there's just a little anecdote there. But yeah, no, this is a good discussion. I again, with Steve, and I don't know how Bruno feels about our other people, but I think they do listen to the artists here, And again, thank you to David for the reference to the Melville chapter 94, the Hound, right? Very, very, very beautiful reference there. And that gives you an example, really, maybe in a way that maybe they are looking for the building of the orgon, right? In a sense, maybe this is where they're ultimately going here, that kind of cosmic, we can read this on a cosmological level too, that the cosmological principles are also operative here, because I consider this a work of experimental philosophy too. I mean, I want to say, it's not straightforward philosophy by any means, but, I can hopefully relanguage this into a kind of ontology of desire, and desiring production as a new conceptual apparatus, which again, I mean, Bruno knows as well, Paulo Verno, Maurizio Lazzarato, to a different degree, Negre and Hart and Empire and further, in their work, the notion of the multitude. A lot of this is generated by this book, yeah. I mean, in many ways, and by 1,000 Plateaus. And to me, these are the more imaginative people on the left. I mean, for whatever left you subscribe to, but they're the ones that are trying to think through the question of revolutionary desire. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Carl, you wanted to say something again?
Oh,
Or?
no. I mean, I think, yeah, I agree. And I think that, the one of the problems with the left is that it's, it is too scolding. It is too depressive. It is too, and that obviously, if we're ever going to see a change, that there's going to have to be a culture that, as they would say, it invests desire. I mean, it's about, joy
Yes.
and life, and, I mean,
We need a Spinoza's left, right?
Right.
We need
Yeah.
the left of affirmation and
Yeah.
the passions of joy. And you can see the play of Spinoza here with the poles and, the joy and sadness and the intensities of
Yeah.
those. Very, very important to kind of keep this in mind. Yeah. And at the same time, there's a very much of a Nietzschean, I would call it realism in a way. You ain't seen nothing yet. And, Nietzsche's saying this 1889. I mean, you talk about a schizoid that sees the cracks and what's to come. Nietzsche's a kind of signpost for the 20th century,
Yeah.
and probably the most used and abused philosopher of the 20th century. Yeah,
And I just want
the
to say,
Antichrist to the godfather of fascism to, quote, the thinker of the nomad, the thinker against Judeo-Christian values, all of these things. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
oh yeah, I mean, just in terms of, if you wanted to do like some sort of, follow up to this on Spinoza and Gemslev, that would be, because those are, huge themes. And I've looked at some of Guattari's other work, and he continues to be very involved with linguistics and Chomsky and this whole thing. So I would be interested in just, if you wanted to. I'm just saying I would, I would.
Yeah,
say-
well, I mean, the drive of philosophy, since the 19th, since the problem of linguistics came up, Herder, of course, Humboldt in a different way, and then of course Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the origin of languages. All of this has been, the drive towards a universal grammar. And maybe Tony can talk about the illegible and whatever he was going through, because the drive in philosophy, and in terms of Husserlian phenomenology, Frege, others, etc., has always been towards a universal grammar. How do we get to a universal grammar? And this is, takes into account linguistics, which is for philosophy a subdivision, but very much Saussure, Roman Jakobson, who was the representative of Saussure, and another funny story. I think I said this. Jakobson used to be good friends with Levi Strauss, but he would visit with Levi Strauss in Paris, but he kept Levi Strauss up too late. So Levi Strauss says, "Go stay with Lacan. He likes to stay up all night." So that was the beginning of the friendship between. Yeah, Tony, I was just talking about the drive for universal grammar. That this is, and of course the grammar of objects, Vincent de Combe, and of course philosophical grammar of Wittgenstein. Very, very important texts, that are also working. And Nietzsche did say, we have not killed God because we haven't killed grammar. And, really, in a way, the police are really grammar in some ways. The police of language, is kind of the metaphor. Yeah, Tony, go ahead. Yeah, I want to know about the illegible. Yeah, the trace, so to speak.
Oh, sorry, I stepped away for a second, so I'm not sure what.
I
mean, I heard
was
the part
talking about the drive of philosophy was towards this universal grammar, universal language, and that this goes back to Herder and von Humboldt and
Okay,
Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yeah, and then I know you had mentioned earlier the illegible.
Illegible, yeah, the connection there.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's all sorts of theories now in composition studies about there's this binary between, like, do you teach grammar to students? Do you sort of impose from without these language conventions? Or do you teach them to code switch? And then there's this third way called code meshing, which is this sort of rhizomatic approach to the whole thing that sort of mixes all the different codes, which I thought of also reading this book. But yeah, so I try not to teach grammar, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I come.
I mean, at least not in a sort of fascist
position. It's good to know the police.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah. But anyway,
it's
that's
better
just
not.
my
Yeah,
my tendency. I've
it's
been
also better
arrested
just not to
several
be
times. So
the
yeah,
police.
anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, they still learn it. They still learn.
yeah. No, I understand.
They
Yeah,
just learn different sort of
yeah,
contexts in which one type of grammar operates and how things like this, rather than sort of imposing a singular method on
yeah.
everybody.
I mean, there's some very serious basic questions that are raised by this book in a way. If you decode everything, where's the next code? Is decoding, in the nomad, in a sense, if you jam all the codes, what happens? Is this a privileging of madness in a way? Is this a pushing towards madness? This is I think, a criticism one can talk about in many ways. And the nomad, the Nietzschean moment of jamming all the codes in order to get to a new language or new desiring production, is another question that's dangerous, maybe creatively dangerous, but dangerous, needless to say, in a way. So are we at that point? And does every decoding have a code? Can every deterritorialization be reterritorialized mathematically? These raise questions in mathematics, in scientific practice, of which, algorithmic governmentality may be part of what's going on, in many ways. We have to think about this as well. I mean, this is another issue that is raised here. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, I think, that, yeah, I think this is a similar thing, is that, for me, a lot of times the image that is being created, I don't see, you've talked, Michael, about care, about reciprocity, about intersubjectivity, about the other, and I mean, and I'm not talking about necessarily in a really constrictive way, but just, the way we are embedded in networks and webs of life and interconnection,
right,
and how we are fundamentally dependent. And, we are dependent on one another, but we're dependent on, the natural world. And I see there's something that I find a little problematic about, this, it's almost this romanticization of, exit and flight. And, again, I just sometimes wonder, well, like, who's fleeing and who's being left. And, um, so I think that there's a lot of things about this that are problematic, in that way, that I just find, again, it seems to go very, in a very different direction than some of the things that in political economy, for instance, I think have been some of the more interesting things about looking at nature, capitalism and nature, and those interdependencies, and the idea of coevolution of human society and the natural world, or the sphere of reproduction within kind of Marxist feminism, and how we bring that into a politic, right? That it's not just about labor and production, but it's about the whole cycle through which the human being is reproduced.
well,
And so those are the
yeah,
things that
yeah,
to me are kind of lacking in
yeah.
this.
I mean, I think another way of maybe looking at this, what does this add to our understanding? We have the Shulamith Firestone of the dialectic of sex, whether you like the book or not, but they're, the second sex of Simone de Beauvoir, you have first and second wave feminism, Hardman in terms of money, class, and power. You have all kinds of different, attempts to do this. You have the Cyber Manifesto of Donna Haraway. What in some ways does this, in a sense, add to our understanding? It's not like it's either this or nothing else, right? I mean, that's the question. Does this really give us a greater insight and understanding of what's going on in this, monstrosity that we're living under, this oppression, and this 50 years to understand this last 50-year regression? I mean, really, in a way, nothing but reaction since this book was written. Yeah, I mean, in a way, not only to the book, but to the populace. When we say the left, there is no left. They're leftists, as one of my friends likes to say. There's no left. There are a lot of leftists, right? In a sense, there is no organized unitary left, or really left to speak of, right? In a way, and yeah, and So I think this is a very important question. Again, how does this mode of, as Bruno was calling it, the mode of servility, a mode of servitude take place? How is it really happening? And what does it play upon this distinction? And I think this is very crucial for our understanding today. The distinction between theories of need and how need produces what we consider pseudo desire, I would call it, right? Pseudo desire in some ways, versus that of what is actual desire. How far, what Steve was saying, how far have we gotten away from asking that question? What do we want? What kind of qualitatively different life do we want? What do we demand of David, Jane, and Lydia from the treatment room, or so to speak, right? Or et cetera. Or what do we demand of of this going forward? What is on the table here in a way? Because I would suspect that most of from what I understand, and again, I'm a very lay person on all this, but in the 50 years, since this book was written, we now have all kinds of coping therapies out there, self-help, and the psychoanalysis is the last thing on most of the culture's mind, right? or the kind of high-powered therapies that are really about the development of the self, the ability to overcome either neurosis or or work with the schizzes, in the other way. So this to me is a very, very active question, and it doesn't come down to just the simple equation inflation and we all had to go make a living. Or, I used to have a theory, organized sports. You talk about organized violence, think of the NFL, in a way, what the Sunday religion is. Any given Sunday that's replaced the church, all these years of Judeo-Christian brutality is replaced by, 22 players on the field in equipment brutalizing each other, I know the equation. To be hit by a running back named Leonard Fournette is like being hit by a car if he runs into you at 29 miles an hour. You're padded and you're a big guy, you're 250 pounds maybe when you take the impact, but think about the impact that is going on, in these kind of things, right? In a sense. So we have all these organized, moments of violence, and we want to shy away from the questions of violence, right? In a sense, we want to work through the long march of the institutions, which to me, the more I look at this, is a form of civility, in a way. Let's be civil. Let's go to civil society. It's no accident that Hegel's, the family, civil society, and the state is rewritten as, the origin of the family private property in the state, the violence that appropriation does. This is the rewriting that Engels does of Hegel. Hegel's notion of civil society becomes the stories of private property, not civil society anymore. Right? In many ways.
Yeah, I think what's happening.
I think this is a very real question. You can trace it to OPEC in '73. You can begin to see all kinds of machinations that take place. Reagan and Thatcherism. There's no alternative. But these are all pretty much surface narratives at this point. They're a way of dating us. What is going on in the desiring machines, and in the desiring production during this period that really just gets into this very different, this other place. There are 20 of us here, or 25 on some occasions, 16 left after hours. But anyway, we in a way, how many people are really discussing this? Most people are saying, how the hell we're going to get through the pandemic, right? And then what coping mechanisms are? We're going to go see Jane on Monday and lie down, or or do a face-to-face session, and I'm having trouble at home, and this is what's going on. So to me the question is, what does this add to transformation? If we define the communist hypothesis, if we will, and I thought our friend Sandro Mazzaro did a great job. The collective transformation of society, right? In some ways, a transformation of society, the dream of the whole person, in a way. if that's what we're about, where are we in that relationship? And, what can we take here? Is really is my question, really, in a sense. And how do we get so limited into these partial objects and these partial, drives instead of really looking, at the socius? And I think this broadens it. It's speaking social and psychic together. It's trying to unify this. So this is a very important aspect that comes back in here. Marcuse tried it, but I think this is an advance on Marcuse, to my mind. Yeah. How the social and the psychic come back together, in many ways. And how we would begin to think this through in terms of the German ideology, that social relations determine consciousness, not the other way around, right? Consciousness is being determined in the analyst's couch by social relations, not just by individualist intrapsychic, moments, right? In some ways, this is kind of where I think they're trying to go to bring that into the room, yeah. So anyway, you want to say something, David? I see you're unmuted. Yeah.
Oh, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Michael, you and Carl had been discussing an theorist who you feel is kind of complementary but a little bit different. And Carl, I think for you, you are connecting with him in a good way. I didn't quite get the name of this guy, and I was curious if you could say who it was. Like about half an hour back, you were saying how you were reading someone else who you feel is.
Carl Polanyi.
How do you use that's right? How do you
Oh,
spell?
Carl Poliani. I'll show you the book. I have it here.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Michael.
Yeah. In some ways, there's a dated quality of the book, but it also has, in some ways, it's just very prescient in terms of his idea about the fictitious commodities. And
this is the book. It's called "The Political and Economic Origins of Our Time" is the subtitle. Carl Poliani. Yeah, it's a masterpiece. It's a classic.
Yeah,
it's along the lines of the Protestant ethics, spirit of capitalism. Read this alongside of that, and there are many other attempts here. Of course, Durkheim too, but this is a real masterpiece, a masterwork. And his brother, by the way, Michael Poliani, became very not right wing in the sense that we use it today. Became very conservative. Was very conservative. He wrote a book called Personal Knowledge.
And that's P-O-L-I-A.
P-O-L-A-N-Y-I, Hungarian.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And his brother Michael, who is also famous, and I think was part of the Steiner schools as well, connected to the Steiner school. Yeah,
the book was written in 1944, I think. So he's directly looking
an exile, Jewish exile,
the rise of fascism, and he's really trying to understand, how does that emerge? And
it's like Bela Lugosi.
For him, it's the destabilization.
From the caricature of him kind of makes him look like Bela Lugosi, another Hungarian. Kind of like the healthy vampire, right? Yeah. Anyway, So it's a very interesting, meta work, you would call it, right? In a way, yeah. I mean, this is again our failure of educational systems. There should be courses in the graduate schools and really even undergraduate about the meta works, in Protestant ethic, the Great Transformation. There are many, many books like this that really give a broad scope of what goes on, and only snippets are read. They should be read along. Civilization and its Discontents, Future of an Illusion, which to me is Freud's most brilliant piece of writing as an essayist. I mean, I just think it's just beautifully done because it's dialogical. It's a conversation he had with his good friend, the priest, the Swiss pastor, Oscar Pfister, about religion, right? And the future of an illusion, right? Michael. And of course, religious psychoanalyst said, the illusion of the future, Dr. Freud. Yeah, anyway, this was the response back in the day. Yeah, right.
I was just curious, Michael, when you were in graduate school, What was your PhD dissertation topic?
Oh, I never finished my PhD dissertation, but it's a work on Spinoza that I'm finishing now. Yeah.
Nice.
So yeah. So yeah,
And
Spinoza and Nietzsche. So I have a big interest here. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what is the title of this? And can you tell us a little about it?
It's a study of both the force conatus and its relationship to the will to power, and Nietzsche in terms of him learning against teleological versions of history.
Mhm.
That no longer should we be thinking teleologically. And that this was a great connection that he had to Spinoza open on, and also very simple notions of causality, that causality was a multi-system of determinations. So I'm trying to look at this against Hegel. That's really the force is against the Hegelian use of the negation, and how both Nietzsche and Spinoza begin what I would call a kind of underground history of philosophy that is not really plays out too much against the systematizers and the major philosophers of our period. So
Would you describe yourself as anti-Hegelian?
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. I'm against totalizing. Yeah, so much totalizing. Yeah. I mean, I think there's always an element that slips through, right, in a way. I'm really against the thinking of, that way. Yeah. I mean, I have Hegelian residue, of course. Yeah. I mean, I've read Hegel, I've taught Hegel, and, et cetera. Yeah. Bruno likes Hegel's philosophy of history. I'm not a big fan of Hegel's philosophy of history, but, of Hegel's philosophy of the history of philosophy. I'm sorry.
No, the history of philosophy.
The history.
Yeah, but the things on the pre-Socratics we did last year. Yeah. No, but the science of logic, the phenomenology of spirit, of course.
No, these are great works.
Yeah. But I'm also more leaning more towards Spinoza and Nietzsche. Yeah. And speaking about Nietzsche, because the question, of course, the will to power, but that's ultimately desire, right? Even when in the genealogy of morals that we often not mention, he ends that book, the third essay, with, and he says that twice actually, even at the very end, the man would rather will nothing than not will.
Yes.
Right, which is a very powerful statement. Now, if we think of that even in terms of desire as a fundamental ontological structure, it's the same idea. Right. And this is to go back, thinking and living differently. That's what Deleuze and Guattari are really offering.
I think that's really the case. Yeah.
And if I may, there is one sentence, almost a minor thing that you read earlier, right? When they say at one point, page 380, someone asked us if we had ever seen a schizophrenic. No, we had never seen one. This is great. Anti-police, precisely. Right. Avoiding that not trap of being brought back to the reality that we already have, the Tina, there is no alternative. No, let's, think differently, live differently. That's possible, right?
I think something that we've talked about and that I kind of, conceptualized in our group projects about cop consciousness, right? In a way, this is what needs to be always avoided. How do you get trapped by cop consciousness? It's not just the cops on the street and the brutality. It's really the consciousness that really has to be taken on, and that we're always being trapped by that. We're being trapped by that in academic meetings. We're being trapped by that by institutions. Really in a sense. So
and if I may, because
Spinoza would not. This is one thing I admire deeply about Spinoza. I know a lot about his life. I'm still trying to figure out some of the parameters of, things that, you reread philosophy, you get stuck on, 2 or 3 pages and trying to figure out what they're saying. But anyway, what I admire about Spinoza, he refused to take a teaching position. He refused, right? he said that it would stop him from thinking. He refused the chair that Hegel took at Heidelberg. And Hegel actually began his remarks while taking the chair at Heidelberg with Spinoza as the beginning of all philosophy, commencement of modern philosophy. So it's very interesting to see this at work, that Spinoza was such an outsider, right? And Nietzsche too. When you really think about the three great, figures, and maybe even you add Freud into this, these were all outsiders. These were not people that came out of the academic institutions or were secure in jobs or something like this. These were all people that were, Marx, of course, as we know, lived in exile, in poverty for a good part of his life. 3 children died. I mean, it's an awful story personally, etc. Nietzsche, had to leave his academic position, was a wanderer, for the last 20 something years of his life, went mad when he was in his, I think 45 years old, never to come back, from that madness, in the hands of his sister and his mother, heaven forbid. But anyway, for Nietzsche, it turned out to be a disaster, my sister and I. And then, of course, Freud, I mean, this was, as most of you know, in psychoanalysis, this was an outlaw movement. This was outside the law. This was not, guaranteed at the beginning. These people were considered completely, outlaws to standard modern psychiatric practice or to the dominant medical models of the time. And as people know here, you had to be guaranteed by the AMA to be practicing psychoanalysis in this country until lay analysis came into being. Yeah, now everyone's a therapist.
Michael, yeah. And
no,
then,
if of course, yeah.
No, if I may say, I mean, although maybe there is no real literal, let's say, connection, but there is, I mean, one application of this maybe can be seen in abolitionist philosophy. Now, I mean, when I teach, and I'm sure others, maybe you too, Michael, had the same experience. When I teach Angela Davis, right, are prisons obsolete? And then if you ask, the question, you ask students, can you envision society without prisons? No, why? The sentence that I just read from Deleuze and Guattari, what do you do with the sociopaths, the psychopaths, the serial killer, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, missing completely the point of what the prison really is. So it goes, I mean, I goes back to this consciousness, but also the whole thing, how in the US in particular, the prison is not the continuation, as Angela Davis and others say, of slavery, the plantation economy, and so on. But the question is, no, you cannot envision society differently. That's the point where people get stuck usually.
Right.
Fear. It's fear, right? I mean, because maybe it's not that desire should be able to overcome that, right? But very often people stop on this.
I agree with you, but I would rephrase it. It's the fear of the working through the fear is really more the point than just the fear itself, right? It's really the fear of undergoing the hard work to work through the fear. It's the working through that, to me, is something that is absolutely crucial right now, that is not happening.
Right, whereby people stay on this
really
side.
The Dararbeiten, the actual working through, the actual work of therapy, the working through something, in a way, or the labor of reading. This book is a labor of reading. This is what I like about it. You go back to it, you say, oh, this is crazy, but then you see something that's filled with great insight. You get a libidinal schiz flow or something out of it, or as David's talking about, this purified pleasure ego, you begin to get the pleasure of the text, as our Roland Barthes would have it. So yeah, I think this is what we're really missing, is this ability to really work through, this incredible fear of working through. There's a fear of reading in these schools. This is really what's going on. There's a fear of reading. They feel they're going mad when they really start to read a text. It's very sad, but this is what's going down, in many of these academic institutions. Yeah, I don't know if you experienced this, Bruno or Tony or whatever, but it's the fear of actual reading and thinking through things, the fear of reflection too. So yes, it's fear that guides everything, and the system is very good at obviously the production of fear, not only the production of desire, really the production of fear. It's everywhere. Yes, of course.
So Michael,
yeah.
What you just said about working through is my favorite thing that you've said about the liberal left. Sometimes I chafe about your scorning identity politics, etc. But I agree with you wholeheartedly that this is going on in the left, in liberal education, etc. That the fear of working through is what happens. That accusations of political correctness are actually true. That actually is a manifestation of that fear.
Yes, no, thank you. Yeah, I'm really see that as a very major symptom out there.
Could you expound on that a little bit?
Michael goes on and on. It sounds almost,
I'm a broken record. Yeah,
fascist about cancel culture and the kids these days, etc. In terms of diversity politics being corporatized. I agree with that too. But what I really mean is that when I appreciate this observation about working through is just that especially language games around all the movements that come through theory on the left about justice or social justice or social visions of ethics in society tend to be language based. So we're going to use person-centered language. We're going to pursue theories that are less violent in their core somehow, as though violent language is the problem of violence, right? And so I'm on the side of working hard in your own deep analysis, reflection about self and society, and not shrinking from, difficult conversations that make you sound racist on the left, while also really making sure that you are working through your own stuff.
Yeah, I mean, is what you're saying. I mean, it's interesting because it seems like part of what you're saying is that there's a certain discourse that it's a language of social justice, but it's very much couched in, it has to be affirmative of the person. It has to sort of validate their inherent worth as an individual, their inherent right to be who they are, and not be, have that impeded in some way. And
I really didn't mean that. I really just meant that we can solve our diversity problems with the right kind of words around describing people and problems. It's really all I meant about that. And that is a kind of, that's to me what is at the heart of what we're calling cancel culture. Because it's all don't say that, you can't do that, when we really should be using this kind of terminology or this kind of, observational practice, right? And I think that all of that is fear-based and shallow.
Yeah, I think that it's very hard, somebody who's been, involved on and off in, various left cultures, politics, movements, those types of things. I think it's very hard to have difficult conversations about, issues about race and, all kinds of things like that. I think it's, and I think we are lacking, that ability to, I mean, there's a lot you could, say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to what Lydia says. I mean, part of the problem I have with a lot of this identity politics and this kind of, sometimes very, very shallow approaches and buzzwords is that what's been created in the system now is a kind of totalitarian use of language. It's a feedback system that loops and loops and loops and stops from any kind of reflective activity or any kind of ability to really think through problems. It becomes labeling, identification. It's only on one schema or two schemas. And, there've been books written about this, 40, 50 years ago of how it comes up, the function of totalitarian languages, one by a friend of Guattari's, Jean-Pierre Failly, called Totalitarian Languages, in which language games are positioned in this regard in many ways. And this inability to work through is a really crucial problem, because we have definition. I read a case of someone that was fired at a university for actually reading Pudd'nhead Wilson and using the N-word after she had told the class, will this offend anybody if I read it? They said no. She also contextualizes the use of the word, and she's then ultimately, ultimately fired for this because she offended sensibilities of some people. The administration got word of this. What are we doing? We can't keep vernacular. We can't keep dialect out. It's not that the people are going out throwing the word around, the N word or another word in these dialogues. You can't read James Baldwin in class. You got to pause and say, I won't say this word, or this is a word. What are we taking away? It's like taking away from a musical score 2 or 3 notes, that might be important for the whole score, and to work through it. Yeah. Lydia, you want to say something? Yeah, please.
Simply that going to the N-word in this conversation is one of my pet peeves. That actually the point of obeying protocol and withholding, mastering one's own aggressive libidinous discharge about saying the word, it seems actually highly productive. I'm fine with censorship of certain kinds. Certain things I understand that I am holding my tongue for this moment in history, for a cause. So I'm chafing again when you went right to the N-word, Michael.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I guess I wish James Baldwin and Richard Wright were here, but anyway.
Well, I read them aloud too, and I simply substitute other words, right?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, no, I hear you, but yeah.
Right. I was just going to ask, for you as a teacher, do you find that if you teach, say, Spinoza, that this is a way that will help you finish doing your dissertation? Like that, do you work?
Oh yeah, well good. I'm going to get the therapy here. Yeah, probably. Yeah. You know what would help me? A little bit of extra time, and to be able to really just get some, a nice stretch of time where I can just sit and concentrate on it. The entire manuscripts are in a lot of writing is in Montreal. I write by hand still. I'm very old school. I put it in the machine after a while, but I have, tons of papers of notes and stuff like this that goes on and on and on. But yes, no, that's thank you for that. Yeah, and thank you, Lydia. I'm sorry. I'll bring up good words next time. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. I grew up in the South. I have right. I was raised by, that's Josepha. We have a very different relationship in New Orleans.
Working through compulsions about taboos is just as important.
Okay, I hear you. Okay, all right.
And docility.
Okay, well, thank both of you. Good night, and I'll try to put together something fun for next week. Okay, I enjoy this group, and we might as well do the New Orleans stuff. Yeah.
All right.
Good night.
Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
David. Thank you again. Okay.
My pleasure, Michael.